Coming up on Night Shift.
This could be a World War III situation. There's nothing to say that this can't expand. We live in a world of layers of illusion, layers of lies.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
We live in a foundationally dishonest civilization. Disclosure is impossible and inevitable. It is a strategic event. If a U.S. president were to acknowledge that some non-human reality exists, a lot of people would be like, oh, so you did lie to us for 80 years. What's up with that? How have you been able to lie? What does that say about our media institutions? How worthless are they? What does that say about our academic university institutions? How worthless are they? There is no question that the Soviet Union had a great amount of sophisticated information on this subject. And it's not difficult to imagine that behind the scenes back channels could have provided U.S. information. Putin was leveraged into power by a KGB faction that saw that national drunk Boris Yeltsin had handed the entire nation over to Western banks and finance. It was a massive event in July of 1989 over Kapustin Yar, which is like their version of White Sands Missile Proving Grounds. Several attempted intercepts of a flying saucer that was able to do S-turns and hovered low over the missile ground at a couple hundred feet and just played all kinds of cat and mouse games. Do they walk among us? Yes, I believe that. Bob was one data point for that. Linda Moulton Howe, who I know very well, is another one.
Ingo Swan.
So Ingo Swan, the great remote viewer, coined the phrase remote viewing, one of America's top psychic spies. He tells a story about being kind of recruited by this black budget organization. He said Axelrod and the twins, the four of them, they're trekking, going deep into the woods. And then eventually Axelrod, they go by this lake in the middle of the woods there. And Axelrod says, okay, don't say anything, just wait. And they look up, and above the lake, this cloud forms. And that forms into a triangular craft, which then starts shooting like bolts of lightning out, like exploding like small little plants and trees and things like that. One of the twins says, shit, they know we're here, and grabbed Ingo by his shoulder and lifted him up. And Axelrod says, so, Ingo, what was your impression of that craft? And Ingo said, are you out of your fucking mind?
Night Shift is brought to you by Night Shift, the coffee. Coffee so fresh, it defies physics. Get yours today at teamnightshift.com.
Welcome back to the Night Shift. You guys are in for a treat because my guest today is Richard Dolan. If you know who Richard is, then you already know why this is a big deal. But if you don't, Richard is a historian, a prolific author, a geopolitics expert, and a world-class expert in this field of ufology and UAP studies. In addition to being a scholar and a gentleman, he is also a very cool guy, and he is able to take these very complex and disorienting concepts and put them into historical context, which is critical for navigating this most confusing of subjects. So Richard Dolan is our guest. We talked a couple of days ago, and at the time we sat down to have this conversation, the 2-week ceasefire in Iran had just been announced, and then shortly after that, it had been broken. And so when we enter this interview, you'll find Richard reacting to that, and then we pick it up from there. Just a little bit of context so you understand how we got into this conversation. And it actually turned into, from there, a very casual, very cool discussion about a wide range of topics. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel. It doesn't cost a dime. It only takes a second, and it really is the best way to help us grow. And if you want to go beyond that and support us more, you can go over to Patreon and join our special projects division tier, where I'll be doing a monthly conference call every month with everyone on the tier. We'll be talking about what's going on at the channel, new ideas that we're working on, new projects, and I'll be taking questions from you and letting you guys submit questions to me to ask our guests on the show. Thanks for watching. Now, let's get back to Richard Dolan reacting to the news that the ceasefire had just been broken at the time we sat down to have this conversation.
I think that this was the most mendacious attack by the U.S. and Israel. I'm not on their side at all on this. And I just am reminded of the rule I learned at age 7, which is don't pick a fight you can't win. And the U.S., as it always does, severely underestimates their opponents and adversaries. And they did so here, in my opinion. One of the 10 points was, I mean, they're pushing hard, man. I can't blame them at all. So what do they want? They want reparations. They want control over Hormuz. They want U.S. bases out of the Middle East. As far as what we can tell, it's possible that they've done severe damage to all or most of those bases right now already. There's no information coming out, but they took out a nearly $1 billion radar system. We know that. The THAAD. There's only less than 10 in the world. And apparently they destroyed it, like on the first day or two of the war. As far as the damage to the other U.S. bases, Iran's greatest strength was America's greatest weakness, which was America has honestly shit air defense and anti-missile defense systems. They never had to worry about it. The U.S. always assumed it had air dominance, and they don't have it in this case. And Iran has a infinite supply of drones and a virtually infinite supply of missiles, from what it looks like, including hypersonics, which they haven't even used. So this was a fight that the U.S. was foolishly led into by David Barneas of Mossad into thinking they would have a quick regime change in Iran, quick decapitation, which just tells you they know nothing about the Persian people, nothing about really the nature and structure of Iran itself and Iranian society. Very typical, a very typical U.S. So yes, Iran did hit some bases. Of course, one of their 10 points was that Israel pull out of Lebanon. And Israel already said, we're not doing that. So this is not a ceasefire that's likely to hold.
This is a 2-week, maybe. Yeah,
that's correct. I mean, we're all glad it's happened because the threat against Iran was quite severe. Iran was never going to give up, but nevertheless, the U.S. military can create severe damage to Iran's infrastructure, their energy, their electricity, all of that. And it would be a terrible thing for them. Honestly, it would be a war crime, legally, technically. And some people are bringing that up, but when you're going after civilian destruction that doesn't have military targets, that is literally legally a war crime. U.S. doesn't care about that, but it's the truth. So I'm glad for many reasons it hasn't happened. However, that's not to say it won't happen after 2 weeks or even less. Because each side, we have to realize, forget Israel. They're a separate entity altogether here. But Trump really put himself into a very difficult position because there really was no way to win by escalation. I think he was seeing that. And yet to pull out now, he can call it a victory, but of course it's not a victory. It's, Iran, one of their 10 points is total sanctions relief. That is the opposite of what U.S. and Israel wanted. They're going to have control over the Strait of Hormuz, looks like, which means they'll be able to charge tolls for going through, which means they'll be able to make up a lot of the money that, they've been damaged by through this war. And they want the U.S. military out, whether that will actually, you think about what will happen to U.S. CENTCOM. Like, that's essentially what they're saying. Will all of this happen? There's a tremendous amount of pressure on Trump and all the neocon, the empire people around him who are they're not going to submit to that. And the Israelis will certainly undermine any ceasefire anyway. They have a very strong ideological, we can say, fanaticism about prosecuting this war. So I'm glad that the ceasefire has happened, but I think we're going to have to wait and see how long this holds. Russia and Ukraine had a couple of alleged ceasefires, and we all knew those would not hold because you have two sides that have irreconcilable positions, and that is the case here in Iran. So unless Trump is truly willing to take the L and walk away, which I think would be the best of all solutions, frankly, I don't know that he's going to be willing or able to do that politically.
It sounds like you're saying they won, right? They get a tax on every ship. They now have control over the Strait of Hormuz with Oman. They are in a better position than they were before any of this happened. How does the United States proceed from there?
The U.S. this is a long-term empire decline. So this is something that can be managed intelligently or managed recklessly. Under Biden, it was managed extremely recklessly. I mean, to the point where I was convinced Biden's foreign policy had been the worst in all of American history, which I think was true.
What was reckless about that foreign policy? Because I think most people don't understand what the foreign policy even is from one administration to the next. How was that so damaging?
Well, I mean, pushing Ukraine into a war with Russia. That is not a war of unprovoked Russian aggression. That's all a lie. So Russia was only provoked and was provoked for 20 years into that. The United States was pushing, goes back to George W. Bush. They pushed for Ukrainian entry into NATO. Angela Merkel of Germany back then said correctly, Russia will only interpret this as an act of war if we actually do this. In fact, Sarkozy of France said the same thing at the time. And both of them caved to the U.S. pressure back in those days. So the U.S. was like, yeah, we're going to bring Ukraine into NATO. And Russia is looking, they're not stupid. They knew that the U.S. was attempting color revolutions all around their periphery. 2003 in Georgia, 2004 in Ukraine, the Orange Revolution, and then was it Kyrgyzstan in 2005. So Russia could see that the U.S. playbook was to break Russia, break Russian power, break Ukraine away. This is all written about by Zbigniew Brzezinski 30 years ago in his book, The Grand Chessboard. This has been U.S. policy to break Russian power, break Russia into a number of republics, take Ukraine away from Russia, the whole thing. This is why Putin was leveraged into power in 1999, just to stop that. That was the whole point. The Russians understood this. Putin was leveraged into power by a KGB faction that saw that the national drunk Boris Yeltsin had handed the entire nation over to Western banks and finance. And it was 1990s was Russia's worst decade since the 40s. It was a terrible decade for them. So Putin comes in, he stops the bleeding, which made him enemy number one in the West. So he's been turned into the new Hitler, which he certainly is not. And the U.S. pushed, they did a coup in 2014 in Ukraine. That was the Maidan Square so-called revolution, but that was all NGO, CIA engineered. And they put in a radical nationalist Ukrainian government that basically hated Russia. You go to eastern Ukraine, that's all pro-Russian, Russian language. You go to the west part of Ukraine, and they're all basically Ukrainian and Polish, and they all hate Russia. So Ukraine is an artificial construct as a nation to begin with. That's the first thing you have to say about it. But the U.S. wanted to leverage the Western Ukrainians into power to put them into a hostile mode to Russia, which they succeeded in doing that. And the people in Crimea said, we don't want any part of this. They opted out. They bolted out. And then the people of Donbass said the same. But there, Putin was smart enough to say, no, I would love to take you into Russia back in 2014, but I cannot. Let's work this out. They did Minsk 1, Minsk 2. And we now know, we have all the diplomatic proof that Ukraine and the West never intended to abide by those two peace agreements. To the point that the Ukrainian army was shelling Donbass for 8 years. They killed about 15,000 civilians. They were ready to invade in early 2022, move back into Donbass to take it by force. And that's when the Russian army moved. So all of that is Biden's recklessness. Biden pushed and pushed and pushed because I think, he believed, as a lot of American policymakers believe, that U.S. power is essentially infinite, which it isn't. It might have been close to that in the early 1990s when Russia was basically lying on its back and China was still very weak. But that's not the case now. And Biden's people and his idiots around him, I mean, Anthony Blinken and all these other people, utter morons, but they were all Hillary Clinton people, all of them. And they had the plan. The plan was break Russia away from China. All of that backfired. They did the sanctions regime on Russia, which all of that boomeranged. Russia's in a very good economic position. Europe, on the other hand, is completely fucked for the rest of our lifetimes. Certainly mine. Europe is done. Europe really destroyed itself. So that was Biden. That's what he did. So it was a ruinous U.S. foreign policy. You could manage U.S. decline gracefully, or you can manage the way Biden did. So then Trump came in, and I was initially hopeful. I thought, well, you've got, even Rubio, they're talking about this is a multipolar world now. We need to make adjustments. I thought, okay, this could be intelligent. Then you see Trump doing basically his smash and grab policy. We're going to dominate the Western Hemisphere. Let's take over Greenland. Oh, yeah, maybe even Canada. I think he was trolling Canada, but it didn't help. It wasn't helpful rhetoric. And then the blockade with Cuba, the Venezuela operation, I thought was very reckless and dangerous. ultimately will prove to be very, very, I mean, aside from the moral implications, which I think are one thing, but I think unwise. I think it'll backfire. But all of that, I thought, okay. He's recognizing there's a new order going on here. But I was always afraid of Trump's attitude toward Israel. It was always his Achilles heel. And I was always afraid that Netanyahu would lead him in. And plus his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, I think is probably a Mossad agent. I mean, I think most people accept that he probably is.
And doesn't AIPAC have a stranglehold on the Congress anyway, regardless of who the president is? So there's very little wiggle room from one president to the next.
Absolutely. Now, there is a bit of a backlash. There's a strong backlash against Israel in the U.S. And that has already, apparently, in the Democratic Party, at least, affected AIPAC money. So I lost a lot of sympathy for the Democrats over the last decade, but I'm glad about this. And there's a lot of, like, the MAGA Republicans. I think many of them are kind of very skeptical or anti-Israel as well. It's not to be anti-Israel per se, but anti-AIPAC, I think, is a legitimate position for us to take. They have had a stranglehold, basically grabbing both parties by the balls.
Do you think also it's getting to the point now where for the average American, it's really getting to the kitchen table kind of issues of like, what am I paying taxes for? You know, they're asking for another, $1.4 trillion expanded defense budget. And the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has the doomsday clock at 85 seconds to midnight. It's like the investment's not paying off. Why are we tripling down?
I think most of us, I talk to my neighbors and family. I mean, most people are just sleepwalking through this. I don't really think that they have a genuine understanding of what anything really is going on in this world. That's the reality. People like you are different. You're an anomaly. I'm an anomaly. Most people, I mean, yes, there's an alternative media out there, but I don't know. I mean, I think a large majority of folks are they either don't have the time or inclination or training or desire to really study all of this. It's a large learning curve. It is a learning curve. Like, you have to be kind of a fanatic to dive into these issues and to decide to take time out of your life to get behind the curtain. And it takes time. And I'm 63 years old. I have studied, aside from the UFOs for 35 plus years, I've studied international relations since I was in my mid-teens. Close to 50 years. And you know what? I don't really think that I had a proper grasp of things maybe until my mid-40s, late 40s, 50s. And even then, I was still like gleaning new important insights. It's a lifelong process. And I had a lot of advantages. I had a very excellent education, and I had the ability to kind of work for myself and to do independent study. And I had a kind of a fanatical obsession. And it still took time. Still takes time. So most people, you know, I've got cousins, I've got nieces, nephews. They don't have time to understand this stuff. They're never, ever, ever, ever going to really have a sophisticated understanding. And that includes with this most recent war. You know, I have a very nice neighbor. He listens to alternative media, but he was like, Iran's got to go, man. And for me, when I look at these issues, I try to take morality out. Mm-hmm. I think once we start to put good versus bad on this, and Americans love to do that, of course. This is like what we're all about. But when you do that, you really lose all ability to understand the realities of the world, because every nation has its interests. Those are neither good nor bad. They are what they are. And they will always be different from each other, because of geography, because of resources, because of culture, all reasons. And that's never going to go away. So to demonize other countries because they have a different interest is unhelpful. My attitude is, what are the likely repercussions of some particular action that you engage in? Will it be helpful overall to global stability and security or not? And for me, this war, I mean, I understand the Israeli perspective is that Iran is an existential threat and must be destroyed. I don't agree with that perspective. And what I see is the likelihood, again, of the unwisdom of picking a fight you're not likely to win. And what this war has done, I mean, it's, aside from killing innocent people, is if they can maintain a ceasefire for any length of time, which that's a question, They would be very wise now to get as many Russian S-500s and S-400 systems in, anti-aircraft systems, and buy as many artillery shells from China as they can buy.
Well, let me ask you this, Richard. How are we not already in World War III? In other words, like how is this seems to me like it has all of the ingredients. It has Russia sharing intelligence with the Iranians. We're sharing intelligence with the Ukrainians. That we're arming our proxies. They're arming their proxies. The Chinese are waging a propaganda war through TikTok. We have all kinds of different things happening at one time.
Yeah.
How do you define it?
Well, first of all, we're not out of the woods. So this could be a World War III situation. There's nothing to say that this can't expand. But I would say behind the scenes, China definitely exerted pressure or influence through Pakistan for these negotiations. I don't think there's any question about that. Pakistan, behind the scenes, we all know this is out in the open, was the kind of intermediary between the U.S. and Iran. And Pakistan is well positioned for that. But Pakistan's greatest friend is China, without a doubt. And China has a very, very strong interest in toning this down. And I don't think there's any question that the Chinese behind the scenes were exerting whatever influence they can. Iran and Russia both helped to veto a resolution at the UN just the other day put out by Bahrain, which was certainly written by the United States, which was a kind of an anti-Iranian resolution. Russia and China vetoed that on behalf of Iran. But I would not be surprised if they said to Iran behind the scenes, look, we're going to do this for you, but we want you to take the win right here. You may not get everything you want, but you're going to get a lot. And otherwise, this war is not going to be good for you or anybody. So I suspect that some of this behind the scenes is going on. And I mean, diplomatically and whatever else people think about Russia and China, they are both very stable diplomatic influences in the world. They have the two best, probably, diplomatic corps in the world. I mean, the Russian diplomatic, Sergei Lavrov and all those people are incredibly consummate professionals, as is Wang Yi of China. These are highly, highly skilled, unlike anything the U.S. has. The United States does not have any decent diplomats any longer.
It's interesting you mentioned that because my wife's Peruvian and we spent a month last year in Lima and Cusco, and we were traveling around. And one of the things that I always pay attention to is the state of the city. And I noticed how much Chinese investment was happening in Peru. And it was tremendous. And you could see it everywhere. All these Chinese cars, you could see, high rises going up all over Lima. I mean, it was tremendous.
Back during the Cold War, America could always say, not really truthfully, but they could kind of say to a lot of underdeveloped third world nations, hey, look, side with us and we'll make you rich. We'll invest. We'll put all the money in here. If you side with Russia, you just get revolution. They used to say that. It wasn't totally true. But look at the world now. Side with the U.S. and we will implement color revolutions. We will implement regime change when we don't like. China, on the other hand, is about making money. China is about investment. This is the biggest problem, by the way, with Trump's recent U.S. government came out with a kind of a geopolitical, forget what it's called, the national security overarching statement just recently, where they kind of put forth a renewed Monroe Doctrine. The problem with that, there are many, but one is that it's really against China, and it's really directed against Chinese investments in South America, which is, as you're noticing, are substantial. And, Brazil's not going to put up with that. Peru's not going to want to put up with that. None of the nations, they're benefiting way too much from Chinese investment. Yeah. So this will be an issue. I don't think that this is going to stick on the United States part. I don't think the U.S. really has the ability at this point to enforce its will and turn South American nations into actual colonies. They've done it to Venezuela, but even that, I think, is going to backfire in the long run. I don't think it's going to succeed.
What is it about Russia that puts Russia so far outside the rest of Europe and the Western world? Like, why do we have such a problem dealing with these people in a reasonable way? It seems like from one administration to the next, it's just the same story.
I would actually start not in the U.S., but at the City of London. So, the British have had a hatred of Russia that goes back 2 centuries. I mean, a deep, abiding hatred and fear. So the British Empire, when it was going full guns in the 19th century, they were bumping up against Russia, like in India. Afghanistan was sort of their meeting ground. Britain always was concerned about Russian influence going into the Black Sea and going into the Mediterranean. And then the other part of Britain was that the City of London financial community there always wanted the infinite amount of natural resources in Russia. They just want it. They want access to it. And finally, in the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union for about a decade, Western banks and Western corporations were able to, think about, we're going to steal all this shit under the ground in Russia. This was like their wet dream that they'd had for ages. And, the U.S. was also exactly on the same page with all of that. So it's all about a fear of Russian power, without a doubt, and a kind of contempt. It's a weird thing. It's a fear and contempt of Russian power at the same time. You see this. It's like two sides of the same. You see with the EU today and NATO today. On the one hand, they talk about how Russia's getting its ass kicked supposedly in the Ukraine war. On the other hand, they talk about the Russian threat to all of Europe. It's like, well, get your story straight. They can't. But Europe and the US, I think a lot of it has just been centuries of arrogance of, being used to running the world. Russia for a long time had to play catch up. So there's that. There was a kind of tendency to look down at the Russians as kind of barbarian. Are they European? Are they Asiatic? What are these people? Also, you have a bit of a religious thing going on. They're Orthodox, whereas most of Europe is Protestant or Catholic. So there's cultural issues going on there. And then there's the ongoing Russian desire to have access to a year-round warm water port, which is a problem if you're Russia. They have a lot of blessings geographically, but access to good deep water oceanic harbors is not one of them. And so they're constantly concerned about having access not just to Crimea, which for them is a non-negotiable, but also Russia periodically wants access to Istanbul, Constantinople. They really, really wanted that when at the end of World War I, when the Ottoman Empire was basically going through collapse, Russia, they were like, yes, this is our chance. But of course, it never happened. And then with World War II, same thing. Russia is constantly trying to get secure access through that strait. They're fortunate in that Turkey is internationally mandated to allow free oceanic traffic. Non-war traffic is free to go through the Bosphorus there. But the Russians, it's always an issue. It's an insecurity. So they're constantly kind of pushing there. And the Brits and the Americans are, look, all of international politics is about control over resources. It's not about human rights. It's not about who's good and who's bad. It's always about control over resources. And the reality is that the United States does not want Russia to have undue access to more and more resources because they don't want a power that's going to be stronger than them. So we demonize them and turn them into, Putin into Hitler 2.0 or whatever. So, and then the U.S. did that. This was Saddam. They did it with Gaddafi. They do it with any other leader who is trying to be outside the U.S. Global financial system.
They did it
Gaddafi, of course, was going to try to create a gold-based dinar in Libya.
And Iran just wanted control of their own oil, right?
Well, Iran has many grievances against the U.S., hell, you go back to World War II when the Allies invaded Iran. I can understand a little bit more. The Iranians weren't too happy about that. But then after World War II, they have a regime, a government, I should say, that was elected, Mossadegh, which was a socialist government, and said, the British Shell Oil is owning all of our oil. Fuck that. So they went to nationalize it, and then the CIA and MI6 went into operation there and created a color revolution, you could say, in Iran that put the Shah into power for 25 years. So the Iranians remember all of this. And the thing about Iran, they're another target of the propaganda because we hear from the basically Israelis and the American neocons that Iran is the most, sponsors terrorism and all of this. I'd like to know what they're really talking about. They're talking about Hamas and Hezbollah, I suppose. Well, those groups have their own grievances against Israel. They weren't created out of thin air, and you could take one side or the other, but it's factually completely wrong to say Iran's the greatest sponsor of terrorism. That would be the United States.
I think also it seems like Americans are in a weird media situation where there are so many different propaganda messages coming from different players globally and corporate, state players and then corporate players. And there's the messages and information that make it through to the average person. It's very hard for Americans to have a cohesive, shared picture of what the world actually looks like at any given time.
Well, yeah, I mean, you talk about American policymakers and then the American public. Those are two totally different animals. But yeah, among the policymakers as well, when you're running an empire, you're going to have factions that have different opinions on how things need to be directed. Where do we focus our energy? Do we focus on Europe any longer? That seems to be the answer is probably no. Do we focus on East Asia? Well, that was the answer, although this war in the Middle East has now taken out innumerable U.S. assets out of East Asia, out of South Korea, out of Japan. So really what you see, I think, among American policy is that it's kind of headless right now. I really think that the American policymakers, in terms of their quality, have declined radically. Like the quality of their decision making, I think, has gone way down. You look at the way that this engagement in Iran has gone through. I mean, this is utterly chaotic, haphazard, and not well thought out. That's obvious. I mean, I'm sure there are some deep state institutions. We like to rip the deep state, but they do have some policy experts in there, I have no doubt. And we know that a lot of them were opposed to this recent war, but they got overruled. So really, U.S. policy is being run, and this isn't just to say Trump only, because this was under Biden. Trump's first term was a little different because he truly was hobbled by a lot of deep state actors at that time. In Syria and a lot of other things, he was really prevented from following through with what he stated that he wanted. But you could see, there's been a lot of rigidity and chaotic elements to U.S. foreign relations over the last decade or more.
Is that there's a story about the Marine Corps general, the war game with Iran, where they had a massive defeat, the United States Navy. Have you heard about this? Apparently a war game that was run to simulate a conflict with Iran, and the Marine Corps general was put in charge of wargaming the Iranian side, and he was able to basically clobber the Americans to such a degree that they had to change the conditions of the test.
To a comment by Larry Johnson, who is a former CIA analyst for many years. He's big on the podcasting. You can find him. I like Larry Johnson. And he was involved in wargaming. I think this is under W. Bush, if I'm not mistaken. And he said what you're indicating here. He said, we realized at this time that we were not really going to be able to obtain our objectives against Iran with a war. That was going to fail. And in fact, what he stated was that the previous head of Mossad, whose name I don't know, the current guy in Mossad is David Barnea, but his predecessor came to the same conclusion, which is as much as we'd like to see Iran go away, it's not going to happen. Barnea, from what I understand, was essentially taking up residence at the White House for much of this year, lobbying Trump on how this war would be a good idea and how it would be won very easily. You topple the Iranian government and put in a compliant regime. That was a complete turnaround from what U.S. and Israeli policymakers had concluded. I mean, that's recklessness to the extreme, I would say. And then Trump listened to him and to Netanyahu and to Kushner and Witkoff, all hardcore. I mean, you could really call Kushner and Witkoff almost Israeli agents. So he listened to those people, overrode other people in the Pentagon and intelligence who said, no, this is a bad idea. And from what the last word I heard is that he supposedly went with his gut.
Night Shift is brought to you by Night Shift, the coffee. Coffee so fresh, it defies physics. Get yours today at teamnightshift.com.
Do you get the sense that this 2-week deadline, this sort of ceasefire moratorium, whatever we want to call it, is a response to that? Like they They sat him down and they were like, sir, you can do this, but it's going to be a real bloody nose and everyone's going to see it.
One suspects, I mean, I'm guessing here, but I think it was becoming obvious. Keep in mind, the U.S. public, the Western public, is not being made aware of the true level of damage and destruction that Iran has been able to visit against U.S. bases and infrastructure, including Israel, too. Israel clearly has been hit much harder than they've let on. So, Trump and his people clearly are aware of all of this. They're aware that their, 500 million radar system in the THAAD system in Bahrain is gone, that potentially all 11 of the U.S. military bases in the Middle East have been damaged, maybe even severely damaged. So he's aware of this. He's aware that Iran, it may not have been before, but Iran is a mountain fortress that's enormous, that's got over 90 million people, and is a civilizational state that is fundamentally unified. The Persians, man, they're the Persian Empire. They're not just going to walk away here. And I think Trump, there was no way he was going to be able to get Hormuz open. It's not going to happen. I mean, the Houthis a year ago were able to shut the Red Sea down. And the U.S. wasn't able to stop them. Because we don't have an answer to the missile systems that are in place right now.
One of the things I was looking at when I was preparing to talk to you was, I've got a couple of your books here. I've got USOs and I've got Secret Space Program and Breakaway Civilization, which is one of my favorites. And it occurred to me as I was reading it this morning that it's been 10 years since you published this book. In the first few pages, as you're setting it up, one of the things that you talk about is the number of sightings that are reported. And then you kind of extrapolate from there what the much larger number would be. And you go on to say, these are incredible, profound challenges, talking about sort of the challenges facing the ufology in general. And yet what we oddly refer to as our establishment culture continues to deny that any of this is real. The phenomenon receives no recognition from the academic community, none from our political institutions, none from our mainstream media. UFOs may be everywhere, and they may indeed be of the greatest significance for human civilization, but they can't get a break when it comes to the man. Which I just love the way you wrote that. But it's been 10 years. A lot has changed. How has your view of the situation vis-a-vis ufology and the state of it evolved over that decade?
That's a great question. First of all, we've heard we've heard some news in 2026, say from President Trump, that he was publicly directing agencies to begin identifying and releasing files related to UAP, UFOs. I think he said aliens in there. So now that's great. That's not a confirmed presidential reveal. That's not any kind of admission of anything whatsoever. In fact, it's not even necessarily, it still was never clear, like who's he directing other than the Arrow office, I don't think anything else has gone out. I mean, it went to the DOD. There's no indication that he's talking to CIA or any of the intelligence agencies about this, or to say nothing of the private entities that I think we have all come to understand have their own role in this matter. So that's that. And it's kind of an open-ended thing. We do have congressional movement on this, which is definitely much better than what we've had in the past 10 years ago. Anna Paulina Luna, who I think has been really good on this issue, was just recently formally, demanding additional, there's the 46 UAP videos that are being held in the Department of Defense or Department of War. That's a genuine movement. But this is still a long way from a presidential admission. And then at the same time, keep in mind the Pentagon's public line hasn't really changed at all. Arrow still says that, it's found no verifiable evidence of extraterrestrial beings or anything like that. So really what we're watching this is not disclosure. This is a struggle, you could say, over disclosure, or even a struggle over transparency, which is not the same thing as disclosure. And all of Congress's language, this is including Luna and Burchett and these people, I mean, they're really talking mostly in terms of national security and operational security, as opposed to disclosure as a public interest matter. And that's not to be, we shouldn't be surprised at that. The topic of UAP, or formerly UFOs, was so toxic in Congress for years and years. We had to realize the only way they were really ever going to get this to be discussed in Congress was probably by touching on the national security or safety implications. So that's fair enough. But of course, what it's done is it's also very much narrowed their scope of what they're willing to talk about still. So I would stress a couple of other things here. Any president, whether it's Donald Trump or any future president, a president may be central to the symbolism of disclosure, but not necessarily central to the whole underlying control structure. Certainly, the White House is going to remain a key player in all the politics following disclosure, but I think we have to recognize that the real center of gravity is also elsewhere, like black budget, intelligence architecture, all surrounding the cover-up. And the president himself, or in the future, maybe herself, whoever, is at least partly out of the loop. I think this is an important point, because I think a presidential statement would be historically dramatic, but still informationally incomplete.
I want to tease this out a little bit more, but first I want to circle back on the thing you said about what Trump mentioned, and then I think it was only a few days before that, Obama on the podcast said, he kind of offhandedly made this comment and then set off a chain reaction or whatever happened. Yeah. But also, I think within that week, within a few days of that happening, Hillary Clinton was at her deposition and she was asked, I believe Luna was in the room, Burleson probably, I think they were in the room with her. She's asked about that. And she didn't even blink. She was just like, oh yeah, this is, what do you think about disclosure? And she was like, I think we should do it. That's something we were looking at.
It's easy for her to say now.
Well, right, sure. But I guess what I want to get your thought on is, in your book, you're talking about the vision, the vantage point of someone standing in 2016 looks much different. The landscape's totally different. Here in 2026, we've got, two presidents and a former senator, presidential candidate, first lady, all within a week of each other. Yeah. Saying this out loud, you've got, Joe Rogan, Bob Lazar interview gets 5, 6, 7 million views in a day. These are network television numbers from 20 years ago. These are huge numbers. The podcast, this topic in general in the alternative media is probably the hottest topic there is. My question to you is how do you reconcile that? How does that change the way this conversation is happening now and as we go into the future?
This is a fascinating battle royale that is shaping up. You have, I've been calling it the irresistible force versus the immovable object, and it really does look like that to me. And the movement toward disclosure is becoming, it feels like an irresistible force in many levels, but there's still an immovable object. Like that still exists. I remind people, a year ago when the UAP Disclosure Act was up for, they were trying to get a third attempt to get the thing passed in its full force, which has not happened. But last June, or I think July, the Wall Street Journal put out a couple of really wretchedly debunking articles out on this, which people may have forgotten it, but I haven't forgotten it. And, clearly that was directed not for the general public, but to members of Congress as a little bit of pressure to say, this is a foolish topic. We've got this settled. You don't really need to move on this. And I suspect that did help in dampening congressional courage and ability to move forward on getting an unbroken UAP DA in there. So there are all kinds of tools that the establishment has in preventing this out. And make no mistake, their motivations have not changed. When you've got there are many vulnerabilities that would be exposed, I think, in a genuine UAP disclosure happening. Any state's primary motive is not truth for its own sake. It is survival, power, competitive advantage, things like that. And international rivalry has always been part of the UFO cover-up all along. So, in other words, if there's been a retrieval and exploitation effort or program, then disclosure goes well beyond philosophy here. It is a strategic event. So from that perspective, the whole biggest geopolitical ramifications of disclosure, really, it's not going to be public shock. I think it would be potentially a destabilization of the whole global hierarchy of secrecy and of technology and even like legitimacy. Because like if a U.S. president were to acknowledge, even partially, let us say, that some non-human reality exists or that retrieved technology has been studied in deep secrecy, then you have several things happening at once. First, the U.S. would face immediate pressure to explain what it knows, what it has, who's controlled it, how long have allies and adversaries been kept in the dark, or have they not been kept in the dark? Like all of this would come out, and it wouldn't take that long. Yes, we have a very compliant establishment media, but there's a lot of people who are not so compliant. So I think it would be difficult. And the U.S. and its intelligence system certainly has been at the heart of the cover-up. Not the only, the Russians have their secrets. The Chinese have theirs. The Brits have been involved in the U.S. side of it. Like, there's other governments that have secrets, but the U.S. would probably become the focal point of world scrutiny. And I think it'd be pretty fair to say that China and Russia would not treat a U.S. admission as some kind of, spiritual moment. I think they would treat it as an intelligence and a technology issue for starters. And then also think realistically, disclosure would probably intensify the great power competition rather than calm it. A lot of disclosure advocates will say, well, this will bring us together, humanity together as a species. I don't, that's a really nice thought. I don't really believe that. In my way of looking at it, you have major powers that are locked in a kind of perpetual competition. And frankly, military and technological rivalry are going to drive state behavior. So if the UAP reality implies like exotic propulsion or energy breakthroughs or I don't know, advanced materials is definitely, or even the possibility of these things, then disclosure becomes entangled with military secrecy, industrial advantage, or strategic fears and all of that. So I think there's a lot of reasons for, we'll call it the U.S. deep state, the U.S. national security state, to continue to resist any attempts at disclosure. And I mean, I think I'm only just scratching the surface here of the reasons. So there's no motivation. Plus, on top of that, there's dealing with the American public. So would this be something which the American public is angry about? Like, a lot of people would be like, oh, so you did lie to us for 80 years. What's up with that? How have you been able to lie? What does that say about our media institutions? How worthless are they? What does that say about our academic university institutions? How worthless are they? And all the politicians have been clearly bought off because obviously that would have to have been the case too. So the whole structure, of secrecy would become an object of interest and study. And eventually I think it would be impossible to avoid that. So it's a can of worms that I think there's no pleasant outcome for those secret keepers. There's no motivation for them to want to just, reveal their cards and then walk away from the table. They're not going to want to do that. Many years ago, after I co-authored AD After Disclosure with Bryce Zabel, I got an email from I call him an insider, who said, interesting book, but you missed at least one thing really important. He said, which is that for people like me, who really know a few things, there is no way we will ever come clean with what we know without knowing that we'll have some form of legal immunity. Because this is just way too much exposure. And even if we have a promise of legal immunity, that doesn't mean that we'll be immune from the pitchfork crowd anyway. There could be so much public anger that there may not be any guarantee that we're going to be safe. So he really implied to me that there's a lot of culpability and knowledge of that culpability within at least some circles of groups who are involved in this. So it's kind of like, we were talking earlier about the military global situation and how two sides can have completely irreconcilable goals, right? And I think we're probably looking at something like that with the whole UAP disclosure process, that there are irreconcilable goals, and the only way it's going to be reconciled is by one side or another being broken. And I mean, eventually, I like to think that in theory, the truth is always going to come out, but I don't know how practical that is. It's been more than 60 years since John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And the fact is that, yes, we all kind of pretty much know there was a conspiracy there. Doesn't make a damn bit of difference, man. What difference does it make? There's no justice. No one's been, and there's no official recognition either. Officially speaking, to this day, Lee Harvey Oswald did it all by himself. So, yeah, not everyone, most people don't believe that.
Right.
But it doesn't matter. And the same with others, like 9/11, COVID, take your pick. All of these events happen. The public more or less knows that the official version is a lie or is woefully incomplete in one way or another. And it's a real sign, frankly, of the failure of a democratic type of institution in which you have a public that has, for all intents and purposes, learned the truth about something and still is unable to get any kind of real justice or overt political action as a result of that. And that's kind of where we are, I think, with not just UAP, but with everything. Because that is the world we've evolved into. And it's not even, I'm not even pointing my finger at one or another bad actor that's made this happen. We've developed a system that, like it or not, demands a kind of digital totalitarianism, digital control, and lack of transparency, that's for sure. So I think we can expect more of this type, not less. So this is where disclosure is really tricky. Like, on the one hand, this is back to your initial question. There's a great expansion in the public desire to discuss this issue, to talk about it in increasingly sophisticated ways. Yes. Absolutely. At the same time, we are moving in a way opposite of democratic transparency, not just in the United States, but worldwide. So you're seeing a kind of consolidation of state power globally that goes against all of the things that we're seeing. Where that's going to end up is, I don't have the answer to that. I don't know who does. Like, is disclosure an inevitability? I used to say, I had this nice little paradox that I coined. Disclosure is impossible and inevitable. And in a way, like, there's truth to that, but it's not really true because it has to be one or the other. And I don't really know how this one's going to go.
It's interesting to hear you articulate it this way, because we just watched the Epstein situation explode into public view in a way that shocked the whole world, and I think also surprised no one at the same time. And it seems like now, living in this post-Epstein reality, people look at leadership and they're just like, oh, well, of course. Of course. It's who's on the list? Everybody. Just pick any name. They're all probably on the list. And
yeah.
In a world like that, where there is no more trust in institutions, and it seems like trust in government figures and leadership is just at an all-time low, I'm reminded of the, is it Adam Curtis, the documentary Hypernormalization, about the collapse?
This isn't the one where he interviewed, is this like 20 years ago?
About 20. It was about the collapse of the Soviet Union. And how from within the Soviet Union, the vantage point of the average citizen was like, everyone knew the system had failed, and everyone knew it was broken and it wasn't going to come back, and it was past, its terminal moment. But no one could imagine anything else. So the momentum just kept people moving, even though everyone knew that this was just non-tenable.
Yeah.
And I feel like,
yeah, go on.
It just feels like America's facing a moment kind of similarly, like the end of the American empire is nigh. We are going to be driven out of the Middle East in a way that would have seemed unimaginable to someone back in 90. At least that's the way the chessboard is laid out right now. It doesn't look too favorable for us. China's a rising power. The Saudis are selling oil in yuan. and, the petrodollar's days are numbered. I think,
Yes.
everybody kind of sees the writing on the wall here.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm wondering, and at the same time, ufology has reached what I would say is mainstream status. Everybody's aware of it. Everybody talks about it, at least at a basic level, more or less.
Yeah.
Do you see in this environment where we are going into a multipolar world, China's a rising power, Russia has all of this influence in its region, the United States is a declining power, is there a higher likelihood that we see something from, for example, the secret space program, or we start to see some of this razzle-dazzle technology as a last attempt to try to maintain hegemony in that changing landscape?
It's a good question. I don't know if I'm able to answer that. I don't know who actually can answer that, at least who in the public domain can. Certainly, I have believed that, in something like a breakaway civilization, or at least I've speculated about that. I've written about it a number of times. But what I've never known is how far does it actually go? How far technologically is it? Or do we have off-world capabilities? Can we go throughout the solar system? Some people believe that we can. I don't really know what I think on any of that stuff. But you hear statements all the time that the black world has got decades ahead of the rest of us in terms of technology. Although really, none of that technology seemed to be in operation during the current war with Iran or in any of America's recent wars. You could argue that those wars are not considered important enough to roll out the highly classified technology. That could be, mere geopolitical struggles. And maybe, the point of the U.S. is not to win wars anyway, but just simply to feed the bloated MIC. So the question really would be, would American policymakers, all the think tanks, all the neocons around President Trump, all these other people, would they, A, have knowledge of and or access to any of those advanced technologies that are undoubtedly buried away in special access programs and probably with tremendous private contractor influence there? So is there kind of a lever between the two where you could say, hey, let's call in our chips with Raytheon or Lockheed Martin and pull out that flying saucer? That thing. I mean, would they be able to do that? I don't think it's going to work like that. I guess I'd be inclined to say I don't think so.
I wonder what your thoughts are on this idea that artificial intelligence is more or less scalable as long as you can keep pouring more power into it, right? And it seems to be what all the top level people at most of the AI companies are in agreement on. And power seems to be the bottleneck. It seems to me like if you were in the know and you were sitting on some kind of breakthrough energy technology, maybe you don't roll out the flying saucer or the triangle or whatever, but you might say, maybe we've got a fusion reactor the size of a tractor trailer we could park outside of a data center and run forever. I could see a path to maybe rolling out some kind of breakthrough technology that was derived from this. Do you think that's a possibility?
It's been 17 years since I first put out the phrase breakaway civilization in one of my books, 2009. I have to just honestly say, for me, it still remains a totally theoretical concept because I don't really see, like the whole energy breakthrough thing you're referring to here. Are we there? Are we at fusion? We've been hearing we're this close to fusion. We've been hearing this for probably 70 or more years. There's work on fusion. Fusion was 10 years away back in 1950, I think, 1960. It was like right around the corner. So here we still are. We still haven't really been able to master fusion in a practical way. That would solve probably our energy crunch, that the AI data centers are causing. But it's not here. So I have to think that we probably have not mastered fusion in the black world either. I mean, I have a hard time convincing myself that a breakthrough like that exists there. And for such a long period of time, it still has not made it to the rest of us. Maybe that's my own inability, my lack of imagination, but I have a hard time squaring that one. So I suspect they don't have controlled, clean fusion.
Are you familiar with, probably not, because this blew my mind. This was the last thing I ever expected to see come across my computer screen. But Trump, this is a press release from a company called TAE Technologies. And maybe I can share this with you. And I just want to get your reaction to this. This will be interesting to see. So TAE Technologies, let me just back up here. They're a fusion company. Can you see this?
I do, yeah.
Okay. And clean, safe fusion, energy from experience. They've got this kind of novel reactor design that is their wheelhouse, and sort of this lateral system. And they put out this press release, Trump Media and Technology Group to merge with TAE Technologies in a transaction, all-stock transaction valued at more than $6 billion. And which is interesting, the Sarasota, Florida, which is actually where I'm at. I live in Sarasota. It's kind of funny. And his Trump Media is based about 2 miles away from where I live. So that was even weirder for me. But I saw this a couple of weeks ago, and I just thought it was the most bizarre thing ever. And
Is this like a Donald Trump business venture, or is he part of this, or is it just his name is attached to this? Because I didn't know about this.
Well, it says Trump Media and Technology Group Corp, NASDAQ, NYSE, DJT. So it's the same Donald J. Trump stock ticker. And TAE Technologies today announced the signing of a definitive merger agreement to combine in an all-stock transaction valued at more than $6 billion. Upon closing, shareholders of each company will own 50% approximately of the combined company on a fully diluted equity basis.
So are these people moving toward a genuine fusion solution? It looks like this is what they're working toward. I didn't know about this, so that's very, very interesting. And the fact that it's bizarre, some would say disturbing, that this is a business venture of the president's, one of his companies, while he's president.
And no one in the media picked up on this. This was completely under the radar. The date on this is
December 25, I think I saw.
Let's see. Does it have a date?
Yeah, at the very top there, I think I see December 18th. Is that 2025?
December 18th, 2025. Yeah, so just last year, December 18th, 2025. And so then it goes, the deal to combine TMTG's, Trump Media Technology Group's access to significant capital and TAE's leading fusion technology. In 2026, the combined company plans to site and begin construction on the world's first utility-scale fusion power plant, subject to required approvals, which should be pretty easy to get when the president is...
The next 3 years.
Yeah. Additional fusion power plants are planned and expected to be 350 to 500 megawatts. Fusion power plants are expected to provide economic, abundant, and dependable electricity that would help America win the AI revolution and maintain its global economic dominance. And then it's got Devin Nunes, TMTG chairman and CEO, and director Michael Binderbauer, TAE CEO and director, plan to serve as co-CEOs of the combined company.
Hey, I just wanted to say thank you for watching. I really hope you're enjoying this conversation with Richard Dolan. If you want to see us do more in-depth interviews with guests like Richard, the best way to do that is to support the channel. And the best way to support the channel is to subscribe. It doesn't cost anything. It only takes a second, and it really is the most direct way to help us grow. But if you want to go beyond that, you can also go to teamnightshift.com. You can pick up a package of our Night Shift coffee, which is the freshest coffee in the world. It's roasted to order for you within 48 hours and shipped right to your door. It's what I drink on the show, and it really is truly the best coffee. Or you can go over to Patreon, and you can join our Special Projects Division tier. This is something new that we're doing, where every month I'm going to be doing a conference call with this tier, and we're going to be talking about behind-the-scenes stuff that's going on at the channel, special projects that we're working on. I'll be taking your questions and asking you guys to submit questions to me to ask our guests on the channel. So there are a couple ways to do it, but however you support the Night Shift, thank you for being here. Thanks for watching. Thanks for just coming to hang out. Now let's get back to Richard Dolan.
Fusion would be, a true clean version of fusion really would. I don't want to say that there's any such thing as a true global panacea, but that would go a long way to helping a lot of problems. Like genuine, because nuclear fusion is not like fission. It's clean and it generates an enormous amount of power. Nuclear reactors as they are today generate vastly more power than or petrochemical or wind or anything like that. But fusion would be vastly orders of magnitude beyond what we're currently doing with the nuclear reactors. So it would provide incredibly abundant and therefore cheap energy, because if you're that much energy, the cost would be scaled way down. And that would also imply and probably result in significant economic growth around the world, because economic growth is almost always directly inversely related to the cost of your energy. So if you have expensive energy, you're not going to have much economic growth. If you have cheap energy, chances are you will have economic growth. It's almost that simple. So fusion would be a major boon, presumably, but not definitely. It could contribute to lowered global tensions, although never rule that out. We're really good at finding things to argue about. But fusion would be a help.
I want to back up a little bit to the Russia thing for a moment. You mentioned earlier in our previous question about the idea of a society that has to break before we're going to get at the real truth. And in the early 90s, when the Soviet Union fell apart and Russia was in crisis and Putin started to climb to power, George Knapp famously got in there and was able to get a bunch of really amazing information, smuggle that out. I wonder, what's your sense? At that time, it seems to me like there would have been an Operation Paperclip type recruitment effort from American intelligence agencies to go in and get whatever UFO expertise and technology researchers they had and try to bring them over. Do you think that ever took place? Was there anything like that you can think of?
It's possible. No one's aware of such a thing happening. So the first thing that I guess I would say is, I don't know of any historical or journalistic work that's demonstrated that that's actually happened. But you could certainly speculate that would be possible. And that, if nothing else, during the early 90s, in the mid 90s, when Yeltsin was pretty much ensconced in, where the U.S. was manipulating Russian society and media to get Yeltsin reelected, by the way. We talked about alleged Russian collusion in our elections, but the U.S. openly did so back in the 90s to keep Yeltsin in power. So the U.S. had a tremendous amount of leverage within Russia at that time. And what you're suggesting is not impossible, but I'm not aware. What I have learned is that Putin himself is, and this is well understood, he's a great admirer of Yuri Andropov, who was a former head of the KGB and then was head of the Soviet Union for 2 years. After Leonid Brezhnev died, Andropov ran the Soviet Union for 2 years, and then he died in 1984. But Andropov was very interested in UFOs, very much so, and this is all understood now, known. Putin, I think this is correct, has possession of either all or has possession of any of Andropov's papers that he wants to have possession of. And, I just have to think anything Andropov knew about UFOs, which was an interest to him, is known by Vladimir Putin. I have no doubt that Putin knows a tremendous amount about this subject. So that's a different question. That's a different issue than what you're asking. But the reality is that within the Soviet intelligence structure, there is no question that the Soviet Union had a great amount of sophisticated information on this subject. And it's not difficult to imagine that behind the scenes back channels could have provided U.S. information. Knapp, yeah, George, I listened to him describe how he got those KGB files out of the country, and he did not legally do that, apparently. He just kind of snuck them out. But he was able to do it, and those are legit documents. We learned a lot about that through George. It's still called KGB Blue Files, where, it was a massive event in July of 1989 over Kapustin Yar, which is like their version of White Sands Missile Proving Grounds, where there was an absolutely extraordinary event that took place that evening where you had several attempted intercepts of a flying saucer that was able to do S-turns and hovered low over the missile ground at a couple hundred feet and just played all kinds of cat and mouse games. And then there was a number of KGB had been monitoring that. A lot of these came out through George. So that was a real score. I would suspect that we probably did siphon some UFO data out of the Soviet Union during that period, but it's not known. I don't know who has any information about that.
It's hard to imagine how their program could have remained secret or like stayed intact as the rest of the Soviet Union was dissolving and everything was it was a fire sale and everybody was trying to get out.
Yeah, that's right.
I imagine that would have been a really interesting time. If they had a program that was at parity with the American program, a society that cracks open and you can see where they're at.
I suspect they had a rough parity, with the U.S. And I'll bet you they still do. Russia has gone through a massive recovery. Putin comes in there in 1999. They were really at the bottom of the barrel there. And it took several years for things to kind of change. The Russian military, by the late 90s, early 2000s, was at its low point. All of that has changed now. Putin initiated around, I think, 06, 07, around that time, a significant overhaul of the Russian military. And they are in a very different place now than they were 20 years ago, that's for sure. So the UFO program, we don't really know a lot about it these days. In my research on, for example, USOs, which I've got the second of those volumes about to come out now. It's all finished. I have a number of Soviet cases right up to the end of the Cold War, but Russian cases post-Soviet collapse, very, very few. So it's really hard to get the information out again. That goes for Chinese cases and a lot of other nations. So
when does volume 2 drop? I got volume 1 here.
Volume 2 is finished. Because I am my own publisher, I'm creating the formatting for hardcover, paperback, and ebook. And right now it's the ebook that I'm just completing the formatting of that before I upload it. Audiobook is all done. So I think less than a month from now.
Wow.
Of course, I've been making predictions all along, and they've all been wrong. But the book is actually every single word, every single letter is done. There's nothing else to add. It's 403 pages of the printed version, which is almost identical to the first volume.
Did you catch there was a clip from Bob Lazar's appearance on Joe Rogan recently where he was talking about the craft, the sport model, the origin of this. Have you heard this clip?
Actually, I didn't hear this statement by Lazar.
I don't have the clip. I can't show it because Joe Rogan doesn't let people show his clips. But in the interview, he reveals, I think for the first time, I had never heard this before, that the sport model was recovered from an underwater archaeological dig.
But there had been enough underwater encounters and also attempted retrievals from underwater objects. Like this, myself obtained an account from a former Navy guy. These are all stories. It's hard to confirm one way or the other. But of an attempted recovery off the Atlantic coast of the U.S. of an object back in the late 1960s. It's not impossible. It's been disputed by another Navy guy that I've been in touch with, and then another Navy guy that I communicate with said, no, it's possible. So, it's hard to know, but certainly the desire to do it. Now, the problem with that, however, is depth. About 10 or 15% of the ocean is on shelves. So they're not as deep. An ocean shelf could be anywhere from 100 feet to down to maybe 1,000 feet, that type of thing, maybe 1,500 feet. And then you drop down to 13, 14, 15,000 feet. So that's a totally different type of recovery. And it wouldn't be impossible to recover something off the deep ocean floor. There is a story of the famous Hughes Glomar explorer from the 1970s where the United States did successfully pull a Soviet submarine off the floor of the Pacific Ocean. I mean, at least partially. It was an unbelievable achievement. So it could be done, but it's difficult. You need 3 miles of cable, man. Unbelievable that they could even do it. But most of your recoveries, I think you're going to have an easier time on the ocean shelves. But I think the U.S. certainly would be motivated to want to obtain any of these objects that come to grief in the ocean. Absolutely. So, and, there's been enough interaction of these underwater objects with the United States Navy over many years that they are, make no mistake about it. Whatever the Arrow office or the Pentagon tells you, there are groups within the military that are well aware of UAP aerial UFOs and underwater USOs. They're absolutely aware of them. And they're aware of them because in my own research on USOs, I'll just keep it to that for the moment, there are instances of United States military craft on the water being shut down, completely disabled, electronically, in terms of weapon systems, communications, all of that. It has happened. And so when you have an aircraft carrier, for example, that has been cut off from the rest of the world for 30 minutes, in which it's unable to launch any of its aircraft as well. And this happened in 1971 aboard the United States USS John F. Kennedy aircraft carrier. And it happened to a Soviet vessel in the late 1980s in the Sea of Okhotsk off of Kamchatka there. And it happened on a number of other occasions to U.S. vessels, different forms of EM interference, electromagnetic interference, to U.S. naval warships. There's no way that's not going to be known by, senior Navy command and undoubtedly the head of the Joint Chiefs and undoubtedly the president. Like if one of your aircraft carriers loses power for 30 minutes, while an object is a glowing orange spherical object is hovering just above it, and you can't launch any interceptors, I think that's something the president would have to know about. So they know these things.
What do you make, Richard, of this? There seem to be two competing narratives out there, or conflicting narratives that I come across from time to time. I wonder if you notice this as well. But one narrative is that the president is the last to know. He's a temporary employee. They come and go. Presidents, who needs them? The real center of power is in the military-industrial complex behind the corporate veil. And then there's this other narrative that we hear occasionally that it's all housed in the executive branch. And it's actually, that's the key of the whole thing. And from one administration to the next, somehow power over this program transfers. Do you have a sense of which one is more or less accurate? Or
Yeah, I would lean toward the first interpretation. The president is, like a CEO, right? So imagine a president's like you're running this massive corporation that has its own momentum. It's got its own infrastructure, and you are there, and you got to keep the board of directors happy and all of this stuff. That's kind of like the president, except that over time, the United States empire has, it's trillions of dollars of material and resources and all kinds of power are at stake with this empire. And so there is absolutely no way that an American president is going to be allowed to have full control over that. 4 years ago, we had Joe Biden as president, and people could like or not like the Democrats or the Republicans. It doesn't matter. But it was obvious that Joe Biden was not managing a whole lot. He wasn't able to. So now you have a guy like Trump. Trump is different because he's a very forceful personality, for sure. But he came onto the scene as very much an outsider and very, very unwelcome to the entire establishment. That includes the Republican Party as well as the Democratic Party. They fought tooth and nail against him to get him the nomination in 2016. They didn't want that. And when he came into power, it was quite obvious that he dealt with a bureaucracy that did not want him there. And you can go into all the reasons for that. And now he's back for a second term. He's clearly much more compliant, at least from my perspective, with the whole national security apparatus and the neocons. So it's possible that this time around he might be entrusted with more information. But my understanding is, I've had some conversations with a few individuals who I trust, and I think they were in a very good position to know this, former government high-level intelligence officials, who have said to me that, just as you were saying earlier, presidents come and go. But the deep state, those people are there forever, and they are not going to, entrust such a valuable program into the hands of a guy who's got to be in front of the cameras and kiss the babies and shake the hands and do all of the glad handing that politicians have to do and get reelected. And plus, on top of that, aside from UAP, there are hundreds, possibly thousands of special access programs going on right now within the U.S. intelligence structure, many of which undoubtedly would be legally questionable if we had the ability to look at them all. And so you want to keep the president insulated from them. And not only that, would you even have the ability to brief the president on all of them all the time?
Right. It's the question of how do you know what you don't know?
Right. John F. Kennedy was in his when he was president. He was young, very intelligent. A guy like that would have had the capability, one thinks, of being briefed and being on top of it. But Biden, Trump, it's not realistic to think that either of them would have the ability. Obama, you could see having at least the wherewithal of having been briefed on these matters. Whether he was or not is a whole other question altogether. And then, George W. Bush before him, I doubt it for most of these presidents that they would be completely read in. What you could imagine is that they may be partially read in, told this is real, but it's really best, sir, that you just keep hands off for your own protection.
Do you think I've got to believe that George Bush has asked his dad from time to time? Someone asked Dick Cheney. They must have talked about this, in a casual way.
Absolutely. I'm sure he would have. And Bush Sr., I don't think there's any doubt, knew a lot.
Do you buy this idea that Cheney was the head and he knew pretty much everything there was to know?
I bet, yes. I think Dick Cheney probably knew a tremendous amount. There's a story, I believe this story. It was told to me. Take it for what it is, that at the end during the Bush Senior presidency, 1990-91. So this is the end of the Soviet Union, all of that, end of the Cold War. And that there were discussions among senior cabinet members in the Bush White House at that time as to whether or not disclosure should happen. The reasoning being that, well, we did this because it was a Cold War necessity. We didn't want the Russians to get the technology and all of this. And now we're moving toward a single, unified, liberal global world order. Hey, let's let the secret out. So this was discussed. And Dick Cheney at that time wasn't vice president, as he was later under George W. Bush, but he was Secretary of Defense. So Dick Cheney was very powerful. And the word is that Cheney was the biggest hardcore no. That the no's absolutely won the debate anyway, that there were a few yes votes, but it was mostly no, and that Cheney led the way to say no, and that it actually never reached the level where President Bush was involved in discussing this with his cabinet. Wow. That this is how it came to me. So maybe it was like an informal sort of series of discussions that took place before we bring it to the president. Let's get our own sense of this, is what I was told. If it's true or not, I really don't know, but I suspect it could be true. And Dick Cheney, there's a definitely true story. Researcher Grant Cameron, who I really appreciate very much. So Grant Cameron called in, this is many years ago, to the Diane Rehm public radio show. And she had Dick Cheney on as a guest.
She had Dick Cheney on?
I think it was Diane Rehm. I think it was Diane Rehm. I know, right?
Interesting.
I met Diane Rehm once. She's, I wouldn't think of her as a Dick Cheney type, but I think it was her show. And Grant called. He actually spoke to Dick Cheney on the air and asked about, I forget what the specific issue was. It was a UFO question. And Cheney, I haven't listened to this. I'm only going on what Grant said. Cheney said, it's like, I can't talk about that. There's nothing to it, but what did he say? That's not something that I can talk about. Something words to that effect. So, but the implication was that Cheney knew, and I have no doubt that Cheney was a really consummate insider, of course, and I think he had a lot of powerful connections. And
he's fascinating. I have my differences with him on a political basis. The way he wielded power, the way
he's one of America's great criminal operators.
Unbelievable. A mastermind. I mean, if there was one person that when I heard that rumor that, Dick Cheney's the guy who sits atop the secrecy ladder, that didn't even make me blink. I thought, okay, Absolutely. He would be the guy.
I'm with you on that. Yeah.
How are you on time, Richard? I want to ask you a couple more questions, but I don't want to. Okay.
I enjoy hanging out here with you, Clint.
Oh, cool, man. I do too. This is a lot of fun, and I want to get to a couple audience questions that came through for you. And then, did you see real quick the documentary that just got released, the S4 documentary about Bob Lazar?
Sure did, yeah, by Luigi Venditelli, who
amazing.
Mine.
What was your take?
In fact, I actually chatted with him and Bob about this the other day. My own video of that will be out in less than a week. So I thought it was fantastic. Actually, I was very impressed. I was well aware of this in the making for years because Tracy and I talked with Luigi about this quite a bit. The project is called Project Gravator. So they made this movie, but what Luigi also did, he has a studio, a graphic recreation studio. He and his team, they're good, man. They're really good. So they took all the measurements. They took every bit of data that they could from Bob Lazar about S4, about the whole facility. And he did a immersive, three-dimensional, interactive recreation of S4, according to Bob's specs. And I've seen a lot of that myself. Bob, I know, was blown away by it. Like he said, this is incredible. Like he didn't think it would be possible to do it this well. So all of that is quite fascinating. But what the movie is a little different. It uses some of those graphics and a lot of the recreations very well. But really what I think Luigi did here is he told Bob's story in a very nice chronological way. In fact, I thought was, very well done, including some really great CGI, not AI, CGI recreations of a young Bob Lazar, which looked pretty good. The whole thing was very, very well done, and I felt was honestly the best film treatment of Bob Lazar that's ever been done. Have you seen it?
I did, and I agree. It feels to me like the definitive statement on Bob Lazar. If you want to just on-ramp somebody into this conversation, that's a great place to start. It was so beautifully done.
Yeah, it's exceptional, actually. Jeremy Corbell did a nice Bob Lazar treatment a few years ago. That's also very good. There have been some others, I think. Luigi's, though, is special because it's just beautifully recreated, and he worked so very closely with Bob on this project.
It made it real. You know what I mean? Like you can hear all of these stories, and I think for a lot of people, Bob's story is broken up over many different sound bites they hear from one interview to the next over a period of years. To get it all in one go and to see it and to be able to, and photorealistic recreations of all of these little details, and you really go, wow, it's just Bob and this other guy in a room in like a workshop with a bunch of like meters and tools and gear.
All the alien shit lying around there and testing it. A lot of the descriptions he gave were so incredibly specific. Like you really, if you're going to go into a hoax explanation for this, I marvel at that because Bob had such a level of specificity with many of the things that he described. He described how the alien craft that he looked at, they had excised, they had cut out, part of it, and that was in the lab where they were studying it, and that it had its own gravitational or force field. I don't know if it's gravity field. He said you couldn't touch it. Like you tried getting your hands to it, was not possible. He talked about a reverse American flag being on the saucer itself, which he said, oh, well, we must have made this. But then he goes in there thinking, I don't think we made this. He had a lot of very specific statements that I just think speak to authenticity. And of course, the fact that he knew precisely where and when the test flights of the craft would be. People forget this, but they eventually got caught, but he took John Lear and Gene Huff and his wife out there. couple of times to see the craft, because Bob knew exactly where and when they would be tested. So he obviously knew things. It's funny, the amount of attempt to debunk Bob Lazar has been so intense, of course, for many years. When I was a brand new, I'll say, kid in the UFO community back in 2001, I met Stanton Friedman for the first time back in 2001 at a tiny little conference that we both did. And the first real conversation I ever had with Stan, we're sitting down at the airport in St. Louis, ready to go home. And he wanted to know what I thought about Bob Lazar. He wanted to know that I had the proper skeptical attitude about Bob. And at that time, I didn't really know what I thought about Bob Lazar, because I had just written a book that dealt with a much earlier period. I wasn't expert in Lazar at all. But I was a little bit pissed off at Stan, and I didn't like being told what I was supposed to think on this subject. But there is a tremendous amount of pressure from different sides. Like, Lazar is just a lightning rod case. And actually, when I wrote about, I spent about 10 or 12 pages writing about Lazar in my second volume of UFOs in the National Security State, way back in 2008, 2009, when I published that book. And I was, more than any other aspect of that 600-page book, that was the part I was most afraid of, I have to honestly say. Because because there were just so many diametrically opposed opinions, and I just wanted to get it right. There was Gulf Breeze, there were other lightning rods, potholes, as it were, but none were bigger than Lazar. But I feel like I did get him right. I was a believer. I believed in Lazar's truthfulness fundamentally on this. I was confident of George Knapp's investigation of it. And there were a lot of people that around Bob Lazar who very strongly was supporting him. And so I took all of that into account. And I think it's a truthful account. I don't think there's any question. And it's good for him that he's getting some level of recognition for what he went through. Because you think about like in all of the history of 20th century eyewitness accounts of dramatic things, Bob Lazar's account is probably in the top 3, top 5 of like anything that you can point to in the history of 20th century. Bob Lazar's story is probably right up there.
He's achieved cultural folk hero mythology status. Like, that's what I mean when I think about this conversation having gone mainstream. It's like Bob Lazar. I was at the event in Austin with Chris Ramsey and Jesse Michaels. And Bob was there, and he walked out on stage to thunderous applause to a packed auditorium of UFO nerds. Like, wow. What a moment to see. It felt like a real cultural shift had taken place, and there were people lined up outside. They were taking pictures. I mean, it was like a Hollywood premiere.
What's crazy is that you really wonder how much he even gives a shit about any of that. I really feel like Bob never, he was attacked so strongly during the 90s and the early 2000s, really intense. And he just kind of checked out. He had this attitude of like, I always felt like he just didn't care. But, and even now, I think he doesn't really court public adulation. I mean, really, when you think about it, he did that event and he's gotten some love publicly, and I'm sure that feels nice. But I really think he works like that.
It makes it even better, though. That's why it works. He doesn't want to be the hero. He just wants to go back to his place and like hang out with his experiments and his, he's a real tech nerd. He's a science nerd. And that is just kind of why we love him. I think it's true. I think you're right. I think a lot of people in this community also see themselves a little bit in Bob as like, people who are willing to step outside the normal frame of reference and try to look at things from a different perspective, kind of outsiders, original thinkers. And they see Bob as a guy who represents that, symbolizes that in a lot of ways. And here's a guy who's coming out from that secrecy and he's saying, look, this is what I saw. And he's stuck to it for, however many years it's been, almost 40 years now. And when I build my worldview of what's going on in the UFO space, I take his story as a foundational piece to kind of build on. And he paints a picture of the program at that moment in time here's a program where we more or less knew how we knew what the reactor was doing. We knew how to turn the gravity emitters on. We understood there was a fuel source. I mean, there was a state of the program that was kind of a snapshot from his perspective at that time. And you have to wonder what kind of progress have we made in the next 4 decades.
One thing that he did say, I think he said this on Rogan as well, is that the extreme compartmentalization of the program, he believed, was inhibiting scientific progress on understanding the technology of this. And this is exactly, by the way, what Admiral Thomas Wilson said to Eric Davis 25 years ago, almost, when they had their conversation, which absolutely did happen. And the Davis Wilson notes, which were also controversial when they came out a few years ago, but were absolutely true. Davis, was told the same thing by Wilson, that when Wilson spoke to the gatekeepers of the program that he interacted with, that their line was, "We've made painfully little progress on this." And the compartmentalization of the program was a big problem, because security was more important, really, than scientific understanding.
It's interesting too, because you have the Manhattan Project, which was famously penetrated, and then you have this program that's orders of magnitude more sensitive than that. But then you have, to hear Bob's description of it, you've got what the other guy's name is, Barry. You got Barry and Bob,
his coworker, right,
in a room. And that's it, figuring out the propulsion system. It's like, dude, we need 200 people on this. This should be at MIT. How many breakthroughs could we make?
That's actually a really good point. It's like, where's everyone else? In fact, Bob was replacing another technician who apparently died and was killed in an explosion. Like, holy God. So, but the impression that you get from this recent treatment that Luigi did of Bob was that this craft, the security measures were intense on the one hand, but kind of lax in a way. Like, think about it. They're out at S4. They got the thing open in a hangar. It's exposed to all the elements and dust and whatever else is out there. They're doing test flights of it. Like, they're operating this thing somehow.
And clearly not worried about biological contamination or any kind of like alien virus or anything.
That's what I'm thinking. So in a sense, part of the attitude was almost, you would think, lax, but it probably came from just a lot of familiarity with it. I'm assuming they had this for quite some time, and they're thinking, well, we know a few things about this, but there's a whole lot we haven't figured out yet. What the hell are we going to do now? I mean, you really wonder if they felt like they were running into kind of a brick wall in terms of obtaining any more information out of this. That's the impression that one could get, at least from this recent treatment.
Seemed like there was one point in there where he mentioned, correct me if I'm wrong here, do you remember him talking about there were some Russians that worked at this facility, and then suddenly one day they were just like out of there?
Oh, they were out of there?
He was like, well, there was some Russians that were working there, and then something happened. He's like, I don't know what it was, but I got the sense that some kind of breakthrough had happened, and then suddenly they were like, okay, you guys out, new people in, something changed.
Yeah, he definitely said there were Russians working in that facility, like Soviet Russians. And remember, this is 1988, 89. Right. So there's still a Soviet Union. There's still technically a Cold War, although by from the mid 80s onward, still during even the Reagan years, U.S.-Soviet relations were certainly becoming much more collaborative, especially with Gorbachev coming into power.
Did American policymakers have, at that time in 1985, were they looking ahead to 1989, 90 and expecting a collapse? Do you think that they had projected that?
No way, man. They were not expecting that. That came as a surprise. When Gorbachev came into power in 85, there were many American policymakers who really believed that Gorbachev's reforms were just a ruse. And they didn't believe it was for real. Gorbachev comes in. He knew full well he inherited a system that was starting to crack apart, that they couldn't keep up. They couldn't keep up in terms of computer technology. They'd already learned of rumors of of the stealth technology that the Americans were working on. They knew about that, and they knew that they didn't have anything like that. Like, they knew they were being outclassed, and that their economic model was not really working.
Yeah.
And Gorbachev knew all of that. So he legitimately saw the need for what he called perestroika and glasnost, restructuring and openness, that the old model just wasn't going to work. But a lot of Americans in D.C. and in the think tanks thought that was all BS. It was all a ruse. Another Russian ruse. Don't trust the Ruskies. So it took a while. And they certainly were not expecting a collapse. Funny thing, in 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, I was 27 years old. I was not doing UFOs, but I was certainly studying Cold War history very deeply at that time. And I remember that year very, very well. And I personally predicted the fall of the Berlin Wall by the fall of 1989. Once the nation of Hungary opened their border with West Germany, I thought, it's over now.
It's over.
Because what was happening is that East Germany was having a flood of people leaving that, going into Czechoslovakia, from there going into Hungary, and then from there going into the Bundesrepublik of Germany. And it was a flood that couldn't be stopped.
And a lot of the police and military were kind of phoning it in, right? Like, at that point, they had kind of...
Yeah, they had lost confidence in the ability of the regime. This is the East German government. So not yet Soviet Union, but you could see that Germany, that the Eastern Bloc was about to go through a real crisis. But still, we know now in retrospect, U.S. intelligence, CIA, all of these people, they were not expecting the Berlin Wall to come down as rapidly as it did. That was absolutely...
What is the CIA good for? They miss everything. They're so bad at their job.
They were, well, you know, we are told we don't hear about their victories, only their defeats.
Sure.
Maybe. But one thing they have been good at, or were good at, was regime change and color revolutions and false flags. They were great at false flags. Through total domination of U.S. media, you can control the narrative. And you know, back in the 40s and 50s and 60s, they were doing that full guns. What do they do now? They don't even do, they sort of help coordinate regime change, but that's really done through NGOs now.
Yeah.
So I don't know what the CIA is good for. Harry Truman wanted to break them up. After
Kennedy too, right? Was it Kennedy?
Kennedy too, who said wanted to scatter them to the winds. A lot of, you know, smart U.S. presidents realize this is not a good organization, but they're still here. They're powerful.
Thanks for being so flexible with this call, by the way.
You have to forgive me that I didn't remember our previous conversation. I should have, because you're really good, man.
Oh, thanks, Richard. That's awesome.
I really enjoy just chatting with you.
You are too. I've always enjoyed listening to your interviews and just following. I followed your work for years, and I've read a number of your books. So you offer the most level-headed assessment of what is going on, and that historical perspective is so valuable. Actually, that's a great question I'd like to get an answer from you on. Is, you know, you've been doing this for some time, and we have this week unfortunately lost Nick Pope, passed away, and I know he's a colleague and a friend and someone that you've known for many years. Firstly, is there anything you'd like to say about that, to just respond to that news, and then I'll follow up with a question.
I'm very, deeply saddened by the loss of Nick. I've known him for a little over 25 years, and I had a lot of good moments with Nick, personally and professionally. You know, it's funny. We used to rib each other because we did have a somewhat different perspective about certain aspects of this phenomenon. I guess in terms of like how deep is the cover up, the conspiracy, and I was always a little more hard edged about it, I think. But Nick, look, he was a patriotic member of the UK government, and I respected that. I had a lot of respect for Nick's insights and his knowledge, his dignity, his ability, his masterful ability to work with media. That was his MOD training. He's talked about that quite a lot. Nick was an absolute natural to speak to the public about the subject of UFOs. He was actually one of the best people to do it because He was a member of the establishment insofar as he was a member of the British government at the UFO desk for a little while, no less. And so when he came public about this, he wrote, his very first book was called Open Skies, Closed Minds. It's a good book. And, we sometimes forget, but like that was a kind of an earthquake in the field. That was a couple of years before I entered the field. And Nick was an very important voice for legitimacy of this subject when it was still completely in the dark ages. So I'm really sad to see Nick go. And on top of that, he was just one of the most decent human beings you could really know in this whole space. Like the UFO field, I've known them all, and there's some good people. There's some very unsavory people as well. But Nick was one of the best, and I'm deeply, deeply, I feel bereft. It's a tough loss. It's a real tough loss. Plus the fact that I just liked him so much.
He was a good man and a very kind person. I had the opportunity to speak with him one time, and it was one of the most interesting conversations
He was an absolutely decent human being, and that's what I keep coming back to. So I'm sorry that he's gone. Personally, I don't think he had a belief in the afterlife. I actually do. And my hope is that he's going through some really nice surprises right now, I hope.
As his passing happened this week, also, Artemis 2 is on its way back from traveling around the moon. It seems like, it's been 10 years since you wrote Secret Space Program and Breakaway Civilization. It seems like we're kind of turning a page again, but in a big way. And I wonder if you could talk to people who are new to this UFO space, who are just now coming into it with fresh eyes. And what would you want them to know? How would you guide them for trying to understand what is going on and make sense of it all?
Well, I would start with where I started 30 years ago, when we were definitely in the dark ages. And for me, I became interested in this subject back in the 90s for one reason. And it is because I became aware that there was a significant paper trail, a document trail of genuine, hardcore, perplexing UFO sightings that the United States military had for years and years and years, through the 40s, through the 50s. That not just military sightings, but intelligence reports that demonstrated that they didn't know what the hell these things were. And I thought, well, that's pretty strange because, all we've heard all these years is that the U.S. government has got it all figured out. There are no UFOs. And here I'm reading reports from the 1940s, the 90s and 60s of these unbelievable encounters that they're not make-believe. These are papers that were declassified during the late 1970s and early 80s, when we had a Freedom of Information Act that was actually useful. That's what we have to understand. These stories did not come out until the late 70s, and then FOIA pretty much shut down in many ways after the early 1980s. Not completely, but it became less user-friendly and a lot more expensive. So, but we had this brief window where all of this information came out of these incredible, for example, in the late 1940s, early 1950s, there was a wave of unexplained sightings over various nuclear facilities at Los Alamos National Labs in New Mexico, and over the Oak Ridge Nuclear Facility in Tennessee, over the Hanford Nuclear Facility in the state of Washington. All of this going on at the same time, all involving disturbing sightings of basically round objects or disc-shaped objects over these areas where nothing was supposed to be hanging out there. These are sensitive areas. I mean, in the late 1940s, it was probably nothing more sensitive than America's nuclear programs. And yet there are these unknown objects just hanging out there, totally unmolested by U.S. interceptors because we had no chance of intercepting them. And you read these reports. That's all I did, when I was in my mid-30s in the 90s, going through this, thinking, this is not supposed to be the case for a subject that's supposed to be of no scientific value. So what's the true story? So that is what prompted me to go in. And my first question was simply, is this something that in the 1940s or 50s that we figured it out and we resolved that there is nothing to this and it was all hoaxes, hallucinations, whatever? And the answer is no, we never came to that conclusion. Public statements, yes, but what goes on publicly and in the classified world are two different things. So So I became aware early on in my study of this that there was a real cover-up in the 1940s and 50s. That's where I started. And that to me is absolutely 100% undeniable. That's a rock solid argument. And anyone who doubts that, I'd say buy my first book, read volume 1 of UFOs and the National Security State. That was my entire purpose in writing that 500-page historical narrative that relies on those declassified documents. And that goes into and reconstructs the history very chronologically and meticulously, I will say. And that lays it out, that there was a cover-up in place. So then the question comes to why? Why was there a cover-up? Were we hiding our own flying saucer breakthroughs, that we created flying saucers? Well, maybe. But whatever the answer is, it's interesting and worthy of our public attention. I don't think that that's the reason. I think the reason is that there was genuine non-human intelligence involved here. And we were trying to figure it out. And that is still what I believe. I think the evidence points to that. But what is undeniable is that there was and is a cover-up / conspiracy about this. And that it goes very deep into the U.S. governmental structure. And essentially has become a government within a government with all of those implications. So that's where I think people need to understand this. We're not talking about something that only now has the government realized, oh, wow, there are these unknown objects. No, I mean, this has been going on for 80 years for sure. The phenomenon itself is certainly older than that. But in terms of government interaction and knowledge, this is at least the 1940s and onward. So that's where you start. You start with not with aliens are here. You start with there's an identifiable phenomenon that is extraordinary, that is not explainable conventionally, that we have been dealing with, that Russians and other nations have been dealing with also, that is answerable to no known conventional explanation, and was the subject of intense secrecy, intense propaganda, and all of that. That's where you start. And then the other questions are, well, what could this have been? What could this be? And on and on. So this is a subject that has, in many ways, had a transformative effect on the United States government structure, frankly. It's something that I think has not really been fully appreciated, even by students of U.S. military-industrial complex. And there's a lot of people out in the blogosphere and video who are very astute analysts of American government and power, but they don't really understand just how deeply the UFO phenomenon helped to transform that and helped that structure of secrecy. It didn't do it by itself. The Manhattan Project was big, and we do all kinds of covert shenanigans around the world, but the UFO phenomenon is part of that. It's part of that story. It's had a big impact and still really unappreciated.
If you'll indulge me, I'm curious about your take on this particular person. I'm a fan of Robert Dean, one of these old school UFO guys who claimed to have worked for NATO in the 1960s and saw this report that was put out by SHAPE.
Yep.
I believe it was. In that report, he talked about, it was called an assessment, and they were talking about, their NATO's assessment of the situation and how they should respond. And one of the claims that he makes in his presentation is that part of that assessment included a breakdown of at least 3 or 4 different species that we were dealing with, and one of them looked just like us. So one of my favorite topics is secret space program, and another one is they walk among us.
Yeah.
What's your take on Robert Dean's story and the NATO angle here?
Well, I knew Bob Dean, and I loved Bob Dean. I mean, I have to say, I loved that man. He was to me, he was nothing other than just like a father figure. He was a wonderful, beautiful man. I knew people who knew Bob longer than I did who said, yeah, Bob's a great bullshit artist as well. I don't know. Maybe he could do that. Certainly he was Army. He was at SHAFE, the Supreme Allied Headquarters of the Expeditionary Force. He was part of that. He was there in the 60s. He, Bob's said a lot of things over the years that I would not necessarily feel obligated to believe. He had a lot of opinions on the nature of the extraterrestrial presence here. But one thing that I never, ever doubted and still do not doubt was his story about Schaefer. That he was there in the 60s, that he read, I think it was Cosmic Top Secret, if I'm not mistaken, this document that he had access to, which is what you just referred to. And I have, in my mind, never, ever had any reason to doubt that story. And I still don't doubt it. I think that's true. And then I miss Bob. I really think he was absolutely...
He could have been an actor. He had the best television voice. His whole presentation.
We could talk about that. Look, I'm just going to take this a little side road here with you. So in 2001, I attended my very first UFO event ever. It was the International UFO Congress in Laughlin, Nevada in March of 2001. I had beautiful black hair. I had all the hair going on there, big glasses, big smile. I believed in things at that time. It was all great. So I gave a lecture and I was so like fact-based. Like I was just trying to like hit all the fact points. Bam, 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 bam. And the speech went over very well. But then 2 nights later, Bob Dean did the keynote and I watched him on the stage and he absolutely had the audience in the palm of his hand. He had this way of communicating, and you were absolutely right. He was made for the stage, made for TV. He had that beautiful, deep voice. He took his time. He spoke from his heart to the hearts of the people watching him, and he spoke from a deep place of authenticity. And that was something that I learned from him. I told him that years later. I said, I watched you, and I thought that I need to work with that. I need to work on that, because if you really want to reach people, you have to speak from your mind, but you have to speak from your heart. Otherwise, you're not really going to reach people. And Bob understood that. So he was very important for me, actually, for many reasons. But anyway, your question about, do they walk among us? Yes, I believe that. Bob was one data point for that. Linda Moulton Howe, who I know very well, is another one.
Ingo Swan.
Linda's talked about this many times. And by the way, there has never been a better storyteller in the history of ufology than Linda Moulton Howe. And I mean that in a positive way. Like Linda knows how to have you on the edge of your seat when she tells a particular story of any single thing that she's ever experienced. She's a master. But she has told me, I don't know that she's even told publicly all of the stories that she's said privately, but suffice to say, she's got her own angle on this that I think is true. And then, there's other areas of research where they will point to totally human looking beings. It's something that in my own research, I have come across this many, many times as well. And I think it's absolutely true that they walk among us. There are beings who look like us, but they're not us. Yeah. I know it sounds, to someone who doesn't study this field, they're like, that's crazy. You're crazy, man. But look, speaking as someone who...
Take a look at Mark Zuckerberg. Everybody really carefully look at Mark Zuckerberg. There's no way.
Dude's an alien.
There's no way he's human.
Seriously, this subject, I broke into this over 30 years ago, and I was so ultra conservative when I look back. Like, my attitude was just the facts. I don't want to speculate. I don't care even what my own opinions are. All I care about is what I can know. So I didn't want to get into any weird stuff like abductions or crop circles or anything else that seemed too strange. I wanted my UFOs to be very well behaved. I wanted my aliens to look like aliens, not like human beings. I wanted a subject that behaved itself. And the problem is, this is a subject that does not behave itself. This is a subject that shatters your worldview time and again. It's really that way. Like, in The Matrix, where Neo takes that red pill and everything is revealed. Would that it were so simple. One red pill and then you know all, but it doesn't work like that. What it really works like is we live in a world of layers of illusion, layers of lies. We live in a foundationally dishonest civilization. We don't really know the first thing about ourselves, and we don't tell the truths about ourselves in any way. That's a whole other series of conversations we could have. But we are born into a world of illusions. And so if you study the nature of our reality and our world enough, you realize there's something wrong here. And for me, it was looking at the UFOs and like and so you eventually, you rip open a layer of that illusion and you're like, oh, I can see things a little better now, but it's not perfect. And then you realize that there's another layer and you rip that. And it's a never ending, for me anyway, it's been a never ending process of just, what's the next layer of bullshit that I have to pierce, because it's difficult. And I look at my own journey in this. I've had a lot of advantages, I was a very avid student of history and of the world in general. And I was a good researcher, and I have a good memory for like sorting out, the different facts that come my way. So, and plus I was able to work for myself, barely scraping 2 nickels together for a while, but I was able to do it. And so I was dedicated to piercing all of these layers of illusion. And it was still difficult. It was hard for me. I had all of the advantages. And it's taken me many, many years, and I'm sure I'm still not at the end result. So when I run into people who are like, Richard, let me tell you, this is how it's all going down. I have the answers for you. I just try not to roll my eyes. I mean, maybe there are people who really have it all figured out, but most of them I think I've not.
I think Linda does.
I'm sorry?
I think Linda does.
Linda,
I feel like she's got it worked out.
Linda can claim that, yes. She's been doing this long enough. She's smart enough, brilliant enough, really. She's in a good position to have some good answers.
And another great presenter, her on-camera presence, her charisma. There's so many of those. George Knapp, also one of those old-time broadcaster guys. They don't make them like that anymore.
George he's another one. In fact, in the Lazar movie that we just talked about, we got to see a little bit of George's library, which is quite massive UFO library. George is another one where, he was a TV guy, but he is a special TV guy. He's a special journalist.
He's an old school gumshoe kind of a reporter.
Yes, he is. And he's just a highly sophisticated man, very intelligent man.
Got 2 more questions for you. You have been so generous with your time, Richard. If I could give you two audience questions, and then I want to ask you about contact in the desert, and then I promise I'll let you go. Okay. And so I polled some folks in my Patreon community and asked them what they would like to ask you. And I have 2 questions here. One is from Lost Reaver Films. Peter asks, Dr. Hal Puthoff cites your breakaway civilization theory and your book AD After Disclosure in his paper, Ultra-Terrestrial Models. What is your opinion of Dr. Puthoff's time travelers hypothesis, and do you believe the phenomenon is future humans?
That's a really good question. I'm familiar with this, the whole ultra-terrestrial concept that he put out in that paper. And I can't rule out time travel. I can't speak to the physics of space-time metric engineering the way that Hal or Eric Davis can. So I'm a bit at a disadvantage, but my instinct is I'm not really in favor of a time travel solution to this. I don't see it as really, I don't see how it can work realistically. How do you, maybe Hal isn't, I don't know if he has or not, but time travel back into the past. So like, I try to think about this logically. So do you go back into the past in the same timeline, thereby affecting that timeline and affecting your own, the whole kill your grandfather scenario? Or are you going into an alternate version of reality? Like, are we in multiple or infinite versions of the universe where you can do that? To me, to go back in time in your own universe has to be impossible, because to do that means, what is time? How would we measure time? Time in a way you could define, in a sense, as the position of every single particle in the universe vis-a-vis every other particle in the universe at that particular moment, because it never changes. So if you were to go back in time from their future to ours, like, you have to rewind the motions of every single particle in the universe. You have to rewind the rotation of the Earth and the sun around the center of the universe. Like, if you're actually going to go back in time, how the hell do you do that without rewinding the whole universe? Unless you're going back to a different version. I don't know how this would work. I honestly, I mean, my brain isn't big enough or smart enough to understand how time travel backward could actually possibly work in our universe. So like, I don't know how to get behind a theory that I cannot understand in my own mind. What I can understand, at least in theory, would be some kind of interdimensional possibility. Like if there are other dimensions where other beings can enter into this reality somehow, I can at least understand that. Also, space travel, I can understand. And space travel is very difficult when you really get into the mechanics of it, but at least you can see how it could feasibly be done. But to time travel, I can't figure that one out. So I don't know how to do anything other than say, yeah, I guess it's possible in some way that I cannot understand.
I'm reminded of Bob's in the documentary S4. He talks about they were doing some kind of test to see what kind of effect the gravity system would have on time. He was, they wasn't really sure what they were doing, but he was like, we knew that it would affect gravity, so we assumed time would be affected. But there's one particular shot, I don't wonder if you remember this, where they show Bob's vantage point inside the workshop, and they focus the gravity emitter to a ball the size of a marble. And it's just this black, and you can see it because Luigi visualizes it so well, and we get to see what that looks like. But it looks like a little black hole floating in space. And to me, that was actually one of the most mind-blowing visuals in the whole thing, just to be able to see that and go, oh, wow.
Yeah, well,
what if you put your hand in there?
Bob actually stated that there were three projects that he became aware of, and the Galileo Sidekick and the one on time travel, which
Looking Glass, right?
Of course, God, it's like right. So Looking Glass, a lot of rumors about it were that it was a time travel project, but as Bob explained it, it's not a time travel project, or at least it wasn't when he learned about it. In fact, I asked Bob about this in the video interview that I just did that is not available as you and I are speaking, but will be within a week. And he reiterated, like, it's really a project to measure the time distortions, as you're putting it, as well. Not really that time distortions caused by the technology of the craft itself, but not a time travel project. He was pretty adamant about that. So anyway, I was going to say something else here. I mean, I guess, here's the thing. One of the reasons that you could consider a time travel hypothesis is simply the humanoid form of the alien beings themselves. Like the bipedal humanoid form is something that, evolutionarily speaking, our species developed for very specific evolutionary reasons over a period of 6 or 7 million years on Earth, where the apes that learned to stand up and walk. And it became a very kind of positive feedback loop that we developed as a result of that, freed up the hands, became tool users that allowed us to learn to manipulate the environment, which meant that we could select evolutionary for intelligence more and more, and that became our secret sauce. So that's something that was very specific to our species. Now, I have thought frequently that bipedalism could be something that could conceivably happen on other worlds. To me, that would make sense. That any intelligence that is able to dominate its world, potentially, this sounds anthropomorphic to some, but I think it's probably true, that this form that we developed could actually be a more or less universal form for animal life forms that get lucky. And over enough period of time, if you have enough competing life forms on a planet, that you could develop one life form that develops bipedalism. And if you do that, that's actually your ticket. That's the ticket. So
that humanoid body shape would be more like an all-purpose shape that's suited for multiple different types of environments.
Correct. So it's not like that I think other life forms developed this because we humans are so awesome. It's like we took this body plan because it works really well. It's very effective under certain conditions, and could be that others did that. However, you could argue, this is where the time travel thing comes in. You could say, yeah, they look like us because they're us in the future. And that's not impossible. It's not impossible. I don't know how to understand the time travel theory.
Obi-Wan Shinobi is another viewer who has a question for you. And this one is a little different. This says, there is a story that Hal Puthoff once shared information with you so intense that you felt bound by a promise of secrecy, even from your own family, without breaking any confidences. Can you describe the weight of carrying information that confirms the existence of other beings while the rest of the world is still debating if they exist at all? So this is kind of like an urban legend story.
Yeah,
about
right.
you.
So yes, I have known Hal Puthoff for 25 years. So when my first book came out, it was kind of a funny thing. So he wrote to me, and he said, "Wow, it's a really good book. This is volume 1 of UFOs and National Security State." The very first edition, the one I self-published, no less. And I almost fell off my chair, honestly, when he wrote to me, because I knew who he was. He actually said he had picked up a bunch of copies of it and gave them out to his colleagues.
Wow.
Yeah, that was true.
That's cool.
So yeah, I was very taken aback by that. So we established our own correspondence, and I peppered him, as you could imagine, I peppered him with all kinds of questions, some of which he could answer, some of which he's like, "Look, I can't really go into this with you," like he does with everyone. He is a guy, who has top secret SCI clearances. He's had them for years and years and years, and he has to keep certain cards very close to his chest, But there are things that we've shared. I have spoken publicly as well about having had a conversation with someone. I've never given this person's identity up. To this day, I have not given it up. But there are people who want to read between the lines, and they are welcome to do so. That I was told many years ago, and this is true, by an individual who absolutely was and is in a place to know. That confirmation that crash retrievals are real, that alien bodies, that's real, and that this is deeply, 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 deeply secret.
Is this the same story that, according to legend, your wife asked you about at the time, and you came back and you were like, "This is real. It's real," and it had become real for you in a way.
I don't know how that got it. So what happened? I was married in my previous marriage. Yes, I told my wife, and it was heavy for me, and for us at the time. That was a heavy duty thing too. It's one thing when you're a researcher and go back. It's different now in the 2020s when this is much more out and accepted. But when I was told this, it was not accepted. It was absolutely out there. But I was told this by someone, and I'm not saying whether it was Hal Puthoff or not. People can decide what they want. I've been in contact with other individuals of a comparable background, so it doesn't have to be Hal Puthoff. But regardless, I was told, yes, very, very intense information, which at the time made me take a really deep breath, because I was sitting across from him at a table, maybe 5 feet away. And he practically whispered this information to me when he told me that he knew this. He said, "It has been known to me on a factual basis for the last 10 years that at deep compartmental levels of our national security wraparound, so deep, you yourself who study this would be shocked at how compartmented this is, that there are individuals who have in their possession alien technology and at least one body that I personally know about." That's actually what he said. And I remember hearing this, took a long, deep breath. And the next thing I said was, "So what did the body look like?" And his answer was very interesting as well. He said, "I didn't say that I personally saw the body." And this is an exact quote, "The data became known to me," he said, "in such a way and in such a manner that it was incontrovertible." That's all I have to go on. But coming from this particular individual, I took that as absolute. So that was back in the early 2000s. That was more than 20 years ago when I was told that. And then I spoke to Edgar Mitchell, astronaut, who back then was alive. And I spoke with Edgar Mitchell in July of 2004. It was the first time I met him personally. We had communicated before then, but I met him. And this was in Roswell. We were doing a little event there. And he took me into a quiet little room. And this was before the Davis Wilson stuff had come out, but was known to Mitchell and Puthoff and other people like Kit Green and Colm Kelleher and Eric Davis and Bob Bigelow and John Alexander. Like and Jacques Vallée, they all knew that the Davis Wilson meeting had happened by then. I did not, but Mitchell did. And Mitchell said to me, so I'm going to get this exactly right. He said he knew of bodies, plural, and technology, alien technology that was being held. And he said that he had two high-level sources that this information came from. I suspect he never confirmed me that one of them was Wilson. And then there was another one, which I don't know who that source was. So I had a couple of people early on whose background I respected enough, who said to me that, there are bodies and technology being held deeply by the U.S. national security state. Mitchell, I could say that because he's not alive anymore. The other person is alive, and I can't say who it is.
Artemis just went around the moon, and we got some really cool high-res pictures in the first few pages of Secret Space Program. You referred to Ingo Swan and Hal Puthoff and their sessions remote viewing the dark side of the moon.
Oh, yeah.
And Ingo famously said, I see some buildings, I see some people, there's definitely some activity here. Is it your sense that that's accurate based on the people that you've talked to in the subsequent years?
Well, I spoke to Ingo and Hal about that. So I'm about as close to the horse's mouth as I could get. And I read Ingo's book, Penetration, very, very, very carefully.
Great book.
He talks about this in great detail. In fact, I have the copy that was given to me by Ingo Swan off his shelf. He didn't sign it. I should have made him sign it. Anyway, I guess how I'd put it is this. Hal actually said this probably he had the most logic and common sense. He said, I couldn't completely, you cannot vouch for the accuracy of anyone's remote view. Because you can make mistakes. That can happen. He said, what I can vouch for is Ingo's honesty. He said, if Ingo Swan said this happened, this absolutely happened. That was Hal's position. And I will just say, I spent one evening in the home of Ingo Swan back in whenever, 2004, 5, 6, I can't remember. I have to look back. Anyway, I was there in his office with him, hanging out all night. And he told me the story with Axelrod. And at that time, I didn't know the story that well. I only had a vague knowledge of that. So people are listening, they probably don't even know what I'm talking about. So Ingo Swan, the great remote viewer, coined the phrase remote viewing, one of America's top psychic spies, who had a lot of hits, you could say, in his career. Like, he was good. Ingo was really good at what he did. He tells a story about being kind of recruited by this black budget organization. He said, look, there were always people in the national security community who were looking for people like me all the time. So I was kind of used to this, but this was a different one. So I had to be in Washington, D.C. at a certain time. I took the train down there from New York, and he meets with these two twins. They're like very military looking. They don't even say a word to him. They are passing cue cards to him at the Smithsonian Institution in front of the big elephant there. And he's like, well, this is freaking crazy. And they take him into a car. They cover his eyes. There's a female driver. They take him. Then they get out of the car. They go into a helicopter. He still can't see anything. This is like ultra cloak and dagger. They get out of the chopper. They go out into a building, and they go into an elevator. He's still blindfolded. Down, 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 down. And then the elevator door opens. They take the blindfold off, and he meets this guy who introduces himself as Axelrod, Mr. Axelrod. And he pays Ingo money to do a series of remote views. This is a crazy story. And Ingo is asked to remote view the far side of the moon, according to this. And he sees, as you're saying, structures and people. And then they detected him. And Axelrod, when Ingo says, I think they see me, Axelrod says, come away from there very quickly. And he wrote out all of his remote viewing knowledge for a report that he gave to Axelrod, and he was gone. In fact, he wanted to drag it out for days and days because he was given $1,500 a day for his time, and which was a lot of money in 1975. But Axelrod only kept him for, I think 1 day. That was it. Or 2 days, maybe.
Wasn't there also, though, a story in Penetration about him going to a grocery store?
Yeah.
And he sees this woman who is like this sexy, she's like
audacious,
unbelievable. He just describes her
falling out of her clothing. Yeah, right.
Right. And then the twins, he looks over and he sees the twins that are also somehow there. And then they all basically tell him he's got to get out of there. And there's a whole thing about this, like that might have been one of the people walking among us.
This is one of the great, Ingo Swan's story in Penetration is one of the most noteworthy, and whether you believe him or not, is absolutely one of the coolest, most riveting encounter stories that anyone's ever had in UFOs, ever. So yeah. So anyway, the Axelrod story, he's there in 75. He does the remote views. Axelrod wants every bit of data that Ingo gives him on all this stuff on the moon. And then a year later, he's out in Los Angeles visiting some friends, and he's at a grocery store doing some shopping. In fact, in Penetration, he talks all about this. He's like, well, I had to get this type of food for the dinner that we were throwing. Like, he's getting into all that stuff. And he's at the supermarket and he sees this woman who's falling out of her clothing. And I mean, this is kind of, so Ingo was very gay. Presumably, he didn't really have a thing for women, but he said, I was absolutely drawn to this woman. So he goes to be close to her. I think he was very attracted in every possible meaning of that word to this woman. Like, he felt, I have to be near her. And he gets close enough to her, and she's not paying attention to him, at least overtly. And that's when he gets this moment of sheer terror, he said, because he somehow, and he saw first he has this moment of terror because he believes somehow that she's not a human being.
Yeah. She has sunglasses. She was wearing sunglasses, all of this. And she's looking over it's like out of a high school comedy. Like, she's looking at the melons or some kind of produce, whatever she's leaving. It's such a weird story.
And,
yeah.
But he's like, she's not a human being. And he becomes scared. And then he sees the twins that he had known from a year before with Axelrod, and they're motioning for him to get the hell away from her. She then checks out, buys her stuff, leaves. And I think a day later, I think it's the next day, he gets somehow a call from Axelrod, who says, it was very good that you stayed away from her. We consider her very dangerous, or some such line like that.
He gets a call on a payphone. At
yeah.
Grand Central Terminal. They make him go there, and he meets one of the twins who is posing as a homeless man.
Bingo.
With a cup. And in the cup is a note that says, follow me. And they go down to a payphone, which rings. I mean, if you made a movie of this, people wouldn't know what to think of it.
Absolutely. But the thing is, Ingo, I mean, was he trying to write good fiction? Maybe some people think that, but I didn't get that from him. I don't think so. I don't think he was making this up. And then he had a third encounter. Actually, he had several encounters, but the last big one was, I think it was 1978, 77, 78. And he's at Stanford Research Institute, and which is a secure facility. And it's Friday, it's lunch, and he's at the cafeteria, and he has to use the men's room. And to get into the men's room there, you had to have a key card. It was electronic. You don't just walk into the men's room there. So he has all of that. He goes in the men's room, and there's Axelrod in the men's room at SRI. Axelrod says, hey, doing anything this weekend? Ingo's like, how the hell did you get in here? All of that. So anyway, Ingo leaves with Axelrod right there. And they drive in Axelrod's cool little sports car. They go to I think a Learjet. And Axelrod must have flown it. And then they go, they're with, somehow the twins, I think he meets the twins there. I'm trying to remember how that all goes. But anyway, it's a long trip, and they go up to what Ingo believed was Alaska in some wilderness area, and they go trekking. Ingo, Axelrod, and the twins, the four of them, they're trekking, going deep into the woods. And then eventually Axelrod, they go by this lake in the middle of the woods there, and Axelrod says, okay, don't say anything, just wait. And they look up, and above the lake, this cloud forms, and that forms into a triangular craft, which then starts shooting like bolts of lightning out, like exploding like small little plants and trees and things like that. And one of the twins says, shit, they know we're here, and grabbed Ingo by his shoulder and lifted him up. And they start running. Ingo said the last thing he saw before he left that area was a reverse waterfall, as he called it. The triangular craft was sucking water out of this lake. And they keep running. And Ingo was a cigar-smoking artist. He wasn't an athlete. So he's trying to keep up with these guys. And he trips, he falls. He said, I banged up my knee. It hurt. It sucked. And he had to keep running. And they kept running. And he's like out of breath. And they eventually stop. And Axelrod says, so, Ingo, what was your impression of that craft? And Ingo said, are you out of your fucking mind? I nearly shit myself. Or something like that. And he said, well, I did get an impression, but it was just a common sense impression. It's like Earth is their supermarket. It's like, let's go to Earth, get some water, get some DNA, get some of this and that. But I don't think he said you can't get a remote view, a psychic impression under those types of conditions. It doesn't work like that.
I think if I remember right, that story also had something to do with like Axelrod gives them some clothes to wear. He gives them like a jumpsuit or something to put on. He says something about like, he thought there was something about the material that was used in it to be, I don't know, there was a reason they had to wear it.
Yeah, that's in penetration. Yeah, good memory. That's right.
Little detail. Such a cool.
It's a crazy story. Like, I mean, if nothing else, you just gotta love the story. It's amazing. But the question is it true? You know, I can't say 100% with total certainty that is true, but I will say that I believe it. I think that it is a true story. Yeah. And I know that Hal, who worked very closely with Ingo, has never shown any of the slightest doubt in the veracity of that story. That I think is fair to say. And I myself had the privilege of talking with Ingo and talking with him about this story. I never had any reason to think that this was not the truth.
Real quick, just because I have to ask, I got you here. Dan Burrish, what do you think of this story? J-Rod.
Yeah, I did meet Dan Burrish, and I was actually with Linda Moulton Howe many, many years ago when we both first were introduced to the Burrish story through a gentleman named Ron Gardner, who's no longer alive. And this is the one thing where, like, you know, George Knapp has really gone out there and said Dan Burrish is Danny Crane. He's completely full of shit. There's nothing true about this. It's total. I don't know. I can't, you know, I've not really wanted to go too deep into the Burrish story because it's one of these stories where I have to ask myself, is the result going to be worth the effort? And is it going to be worth it for me to spend X amount of time in this? And what do I do with this? How can I prove this? How can I work with this historically? Having said all of that, I just can't, you know, Stanton Friedman had this expression, the gray basket. I don't know if it's true. I don't know if it's false. And Burrish is in that gray basket for me. I'm not willing to just say I think it's complete and bogus, but I can't, I'm not confident enough to say that I believe it's all true. But I think it could be true. I mean, there's a number of other accounts. There's the late Bill Uhouse, who talked about, you know, project, was it Redgate, where he worked on a craft, and he had a creature named J-Rod that he talked about. And I think Uhouse was truthful. He had a very legit background, that guy.
Did you meet Dan? You said you met Dan Burrish at one point?
Yeah, I met him. I need to be careful here. Did I actually meet Dan Burrish? Because I feel like I did. We were at one event together, and I'm pretty sure that we shook hands and chatted, but I never had a sit down with him. I never had a sit down with Dan Burrish, so I don't want to misrepresent that.
He has the
I
weirdest.
spent a lot of time with his story.
Have you ever looked at his website? It is the weirdest. Eagles Disobey.
Or Eagles Disobey. What's
so weird. Yeah.
I used to go there. Yeah, what's the name of it? Eagles Disobey.
eaglesdisobey.net, and it's the most cryptic, bizarro website that makes no sense to any rational, reasonable person.
Well, it's been a while since I've been there, so
like
there it is.
Yeah, Eagles Disobey. So Dan and Marcy's flagship website, all projects.
Marcy. Like his controller, basically, is how she's always portrayed, I think.
Right.
You know?
Weird. Yeah. Just little memes and stuff, and then just little coded language and weird team ops.
I'll tell you this: if you listen to him talk about his background in biology, microbiology.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, look, I'm not a microbiologist, but I listen to this man and I think he sounds like he knows what the hell he's talking about, doesn't he?
I mean, think so.
Think so. He seems very intelligent. Like very intelligent, not some security guard at a Las Vegas casino, which is
seems every bit as it seems to me like George Knapp's assessment was based on an incomplete picture, because when you look at what somebody like Brian Jackson has done with the Dan Burrish, the Burrish Archives website, there is a pretty sizable paper trail on this guy, and it's interesting when you look at it. He did give a lecture at I forget which university it was, on some of the subject matter that he's supposed to be an expert in. And it's just an interesting story. He's kind of vanished from public view. He hasn't sought any publicity. It's every bit as weird as Bob's story.
Mm-hmm.
I just find it really fascinating.
I agree with you.
It's this mythology.
I'm kind of interested in him, but I mean, it could be to my discredit that I never really dove more deeply and tried to make sense out of it one way or the other. I actually went to a period where Ron Gardner was, every time I would travel, Ron Gardner would be at an event, and Ron, it was his mission to promote Dan Burrish. And because I was one of the very few people who would even listen to Ron would latch on to me every time. And I would try to avoid Ron after a while. It's the truth. I was like, oh shit, here we go again. But I have massive notebooks that Ron put together on Dan Burrish. And I did read them, and it's very interesting. And I can't dismiss Dan Burrish. I just can't. So I think, I have a lot of respect for George Knapp, tremendous respect. And, but yeah, I mean, my opinion, it's not impossible that he's wrong on this one.
And George, to his credit,
but
to his credit, George is one man, and he can't chase down every story. So I'm sure that he gets bombarded with people who are like, "Oh yeah, this happened, that happened," and at some point he just has to decide where he's going to invest his time.
Can't be an expert. So hey, Marilyn Monroe wasn't much of a cook, but we still love her. Not everyone can do everything in all areas. So if you miss one thing, well. It's like, but yeah, he's probably the biggest name to kind of throw cold water on the story. So he's important in that way. But I don't know. I mean, look, if Dan Burrish has a legit story to make, maybe there's a way that he can come out and make his case more convincing. I guess that's all I can say.
Sure. You're going to be presenting at Contact in the Desert May 28th through the 1st of the following month. Well, you're not going to be presenting that whole time, obviously, but you're going to be there, and that's when the event's going to be.
I'm going to be virtual this year. I'm not flying there.
Virtual.
So
okay.
I've gone there every year. I hope to go there again next year, but I have it's called a vestibular disorder, so it's very painful. It's hard for me to right now get into an airplane and do the flying. So it sucks. I don't like it. I'm living with it. Not happy about it. I hope
with the state of air travel in this country, you're probably better off staying home.
Well, there's that as well. Honestly, I have flown so many times in my life, and I'll do it again. I'm sure that this is a temporary situation, but for right now, I'm just not planning any flying for the year.
Have you decided what you're going to present on yet?
They need an answer from me this week, so I'm going to put my lecture ideas together. No, I have not put it together yet. So I may do it on
Dan Burrish. There you go. So you got
oh yeah, of course. I may do it on my second volume of the USO trilogy, because that will be done by then. And I think it'll be an interesting thing to talk about. A lot of amazing cases in that. But there are a lot of things that I'm really deeply interested in that I would love to do a book about in the future. One is kind of exobiological speculation on the nature of alien intelligence. I've really gone into this. It's actually, of all the aspects of ufology, probably the most interesting to me right now is thinking about them. And
I just
put a lot of thoughts together about it.
I just had a conversation with Thomas Jane the other day about this very topic. He's working on a book called A Human's Guide to Visiting Aliens.
Yeah.
About the same.
I'm a big fan of Thomas Jane. I really like him.
He's great. He's such a cool
awesome guy.
Punisher.
Great guy. He's a Hollywood actor. If people don't know, he did the TV show, which I watched with Tracy. The hell is it called? I can't remember.
The Expanse? Hung? Expanse? He's done, gosh.
That's the one.
Yeah. Great show.
He was, that show kind of went sideways, but he was great. His character was
so good.
Yeah. And then he's really into the subject, and he's a good writer, and he's a very good communicator.
Cool guy.
Yeah.
Richard, I have kept you for almost 3 hours. You are so awesome. Is there anything else that you want to say to the people before I let you go?
Well, check out my website. I mean, look, it's Richard Dolan members. I have free stuff there. I got paywall stuff there. You can go take a look at that. My YouTube channel is Richard Dolan Intelligent Disclosure, and people can check that out. But I keep myself busy. I enjoy, honestly, Clint, I feel like one of the luckiest people in the world. I get to spend my time thinking and writing and talking about a subject that I am fascinated by, and I get to do this. How often is that? So I really lucked out, and I still enjoy what I do. There are days when I don't want to think about all of this, but ultimately it's my curiosity that keeps me coming back. So I feel very lucky to do it. As far as the first, we talked for about 30 minutes on contemporary geopolitics. I've tried to be careful with my non-UFO geopolitical statements, but they do come out every now and then. The funny thing is that people, when they agree with what I have to say, they're like, rock on, Richard, great. When they don't agree with what I have to say, they're always like, you should stay in your lane, stick to UFOs. What I would tell those people, though, is that I entered the field of UFOs through the study of international geopolitics, and I've studied international relations for much longer than I've studied UFOs. I'm not saying that I know it better than UFOs, but close.
And it's important context. I mean, the UFO thing is not in a vacuum. It may appear to be, but it's actually part of a bigger system.
Yes. I mean, you can't understand the UFO cover-up without a genuine you want to ask yourself, okay, so the phenomenon's real, check. There's a cover-up, check. How does that cover-up work? Now, that's when you really have to get into the weeds, because that means you have to leave your kindergarten level of understanding of the U.S. government aside, all the stuff that you were taught in your
Schoolhouse Rock,
school, all the nonsense, and you have to get into the truth. And so that means you have to actually understand the true structure of power in this world. That's not easy, because that is something that is definitely kept from us systematically and for a reason. I mean, we live in this thing we call a democracy, but of course, a democracy can't truly exist in our world. It's not possible. We have a very hierarchical pyramid type structure. I'm almost tempted to say of necessity, but let's just say it's how it has always been. And when you have a few people at the top of that pyramid, they're thinking now, oh crap, okay, we're supposed to be a democracy. All right, well, how do we game this system so that we can work with it and master it? And believe me, they've mastered it. They know how to manipulate the public. They know how to put a ring through our collective nose and pull us through the field like a beast. Like cattle. They know exactly how to do that. So they're actually really, when they complain about the Chinese model of controlling the population, it's only because they're not as good at that method of control. What they're great at is this method of control, propaganda and fake democracy. They're fucking great at that. So that's, of course, the model that they want. So it's all about, so you have to understand the nature of your society. You have to understand the true nature of power in this world. And that means internationally. And if you don't understand that, we're just playing at disclosure. See, we need to understand that. And so, yes, sometimes my geopolitical analyses, like I try to be careful because I realize people will listen to me because they want to hear the UFO part of it. And then the politics is always so divisive. And especially in the age of Trump, it's like you either hate the guy or you love the guy. And there's no middle ground there usually. And so I've learned to have to be careful. I don't know. I thought I was pretty even-handed.
I think so. And I think also in the post-Epstein era, people have realized that what they thought about their political alignments in the past probably matters less than they want it to. Right. And maybe we're more alike than we are different.
I'm not a supporter of either of the political parties. I've never been a Republican or a Democrat. I've never. I was proud of the fact that when my very first book came out years ago, I did an event somewhere, I think in Minnesota. These two older guys came up to me. I was still nice and young back then. They said, "We're having an argument about you. I think you're a Republican and my friend here thinks you're a Democrat." And I said, "Well, I'm really glad that you're debating that because I wanted to be as even-handed in my treatment of this subject as I could. So if you guys can't agree, then I'm doing something right." And I've always felt that way, including within the Trump era. I've never taken an all one or all the other position on him. I've never been like that. I try to be nuanced, and sometimes people like that, and sometimes they don't like that.
Well, Republican or Democrat are a scholar and a gentleman, Richard. And thank you for coming on the show and spending almost 3 hours hanging out with me. This has been one of my favorite conversations.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a bit of a surprise, but very nice. I enjoyed it very much, Clinton. I want to give a big shout out to your viewers of your channel. So glad you guys
could. Thank you, sir. Well, I will have to circle back with you. Maybe we can pick this up again for another one. But in the meantime, this has been so much fun. Thank you again for being so generous with your time, Richard, and keep fighting the good fight.
My pleasure, sir. Thank you very much for having me.